thought it was an accident. Nobody knew what happened in that room. Everybody was trying to, like, all of a sudden 100%, it's Frank and he did it. And I'm like, no, we don't know everything. We don't know what happened up there. And did I want to think he was innocent and my daughter was guilty? No. But
Why are you defending him?
let me get to the point.
I want to know why.
I want to get to the point. I'm not trying to defend him. This whole part of it's pissing me off because I'm sorry that I can't get all the way to end and be so mad that he goddamn did it, because my brain can't do that with anybody. I cannot make anybody 100% guilty. Maybe I'm just too caring of a person, stupid, and see his face, or I don't know.
I'm trying to show the evidence that he did it so that we can show the world that he did it.
Just frustrated and pissed at myself because I can't just, he's guilty, but my brain can't be 100%. I'm so sorry. God damn it. Because if I think he's not guilty, then my daughter's guilty. It.
I am currently incarcerated at Greenhaven Correctional Facility and serving 25 years to life. Up until now, I have never spoken publicly about the matter.
If I ever did go visit him, I'll hopefully be on the other side of the glass. I'm so angry. I'm so mad that she's gone. I wish he would have died. To see this picture of my granddaughter with my daughter and my daughter being a mother, this has got to be one of my most favorite pictures. This is so serene. I love this picture. I could look at this every single day. If I want to think about pleasant memories of her, this is one of them. Everybody wanted to be around her. But she had a tight-knit group of friends that were, there was a bunch of girls and a bunch of guys. Frank Brett was part of Elizabeth's group of friends. And he was a very handsome boy and very charismatic, and he just drew you right in. Wow. This is a picture of Frank. That's the Frank I remember. Frank had amazing eyes. That's where the charm came from, was piercing eyes, and he paid attention to what you were saying. And he really liked to charm all the mothers, to get into all their good graces. I have no idea some days on how it's gone from the Frank I know to the Frank where he's at. He took my child, and she's gone from everybody's life. I just lost a complete part of myself. And nothing can ever fill it, nothing. Elizabeth and her husband, I think they were only really together for about 2 years, and then they eventually got divorced. I believe that she reconnected with Frank in 2016. Frank was really gone from my personal life for probably a good 8 to 10 years that I hadn't seen him. And When he walked in the house, he was not the same person that I knew. I loved Frank. He's been around forever. And it was another person around the house to be able to help me with things. I have an amazing garden. I love my garden so much, it was like kids. And I would watch them grow. One day, Frank helped me put up a wire fence around the whole garden to try to keep the dog out of the garden. Those were my garden babies, you know, and I wanted them protected. I did a lot of work on those. The next day, I remember walking out into the yard and it was on the ground. It was completely ripped out of the ground like a giant just pulled it out in one piece and threw it over on the grass. But I just really thought somebody from the neighborhood just came and pulled it out. And I told my daughter, she's like, yeah. She goes, well, Frank overheard you talking and didn't like it, so he figured since he did all this stuff for you and you weren't like grateful or you bitched about something, that he just ripped it out. She goes, well, when you talk to your brother too loud on the phone, people can overhear you.
Yeah, that's what happens when you talk about somebody behind their back.
My brother is my person that I would go to vent about her stuff. And she goes, well, you made him mad. It's just like, what behavior, what did I do, what did I say to make him react that way? He was angry and took it out on me by doing something that he knew would hurt me.
What am I supposed to do?
Something, anything.
They were upstairs in a whole separate world. You could just hear them yelling like back and forth, and it would just be screaming.
I need you to do better.
How is this my fault?
My granddaughter, she would hear the noise and hear them fighting. And I asked if they scared her, and she said, yeah, and they wake her up. But then it got to the point that I had to tell my granddaughter that if it got too loud and she got scared, that she had to come downstairs.
Around, Frank.
My daughter was not an angel. She would just do things to really cut you with her tongue. I wanted to stay out of the whole conversation about it because I just didn't want to get personal with my daughter and her stuff. It's like not my business, really.
I'm doing everything I can to take care of her.
One night when they were fighting, and she's like, just get out. It doesn't matter what she said. It's the fact that his reaction to whatever was said was to break something, hit something. So he punched the window out on the way out. And he shows a window which could hurt him. Why did you do that? We see all the things there. All the anger's there. You see the anger, all this anger and these things being done. Their relationship was just needed to end. It was just too toxic. And it's another moment of me not stepping in to stop the crap that was happening because I was too afraid of living the relationship with my daughter, and now my daughter's dead because I did not step in and tell her, I am not your roommate right now. I am your mother. Stop this. Get him out of here. We're gonna make him go out of here. That is what I regret the most. I should have been a parent. I should have been a mother. She probably wouldn't be dead right now. I'm gonna be really blunt and rude. I know you're gonna edit. I wanted that piece of out of my house. I wanted him out of my house because the whole situation was toxic. And my daughter is now dead because she could not make a decision to get the... You're gonna be able to cut all this out to get that out of my house. And that is the most important thing about this whole interview, is we do not need to have another person to make us be human. We don't. Get rid of the trash. Get rid of it. You don't need it. And you can find somebody else or be by yourself and not being burned to death. I'm so angry. I'm so mad that she's gone. I wish she would have died. I specifically remember my son, he's like, Mom, Elizabeth is throwing out Frank's stuff. She put his bike out to the curb. She was doing all kinds of teenager type stuff. I threw your bike out, took a picture, threw the bike out. I just didn't know what kind of drama was gonna happen. I went to bed. I was safe. We were safe. I had woken up to hearing the loud noise upstairs, and then I smelled wires burning. I remember the noise upstairs was just the most awfulest thing I had ever heard. My son was banging on the door, saying that the house was on fire. I just go into this mode of just knowing the house is on fire, so I go into the kitchen. My granddaughter was covered in a blanket and safe, and I remember scanning everything, looking for flames like anywhere, and then I looked down and Frank was on fire. I can see him smoldering, and I can see the leather jacket just burning away like a leaf. And then I remember thinking I was gonna save my daughter, trying to go up the stairs to see what was going on.
No, you can't go upstairs.
I gotta get my
You have to
daughter.
go.
My son wouldn't let me go upstairs, and he's like, you can't get, there's too much smoke. Please, no, if you go up there, you're gonna die. No. I was like, let me go, no. You can't not go. Get out of the house. It seemed like forever later. The fireman come over and he's like, we found the body of a woman. She was burned to, there was no way to identify her except for her one arm that did not get burned. I lost my child. God, what the have I done in another world? Another universe, a parallel universe. For me to be it, it's like, God, just tell me. Tell me what it is you want me to do, but why did you have to take my daughter? She's 28 years old, why? From what I had heard, Frank had broken into a house down the street. he got arrested for breaking into the house. But then the police realized by seeing all the burns on him that he was the original person they were looking for. He had a lot of percent of his body burned away. Why was he hiding? He broke into somebody's house. Why would you not go seek help? Why did you leave in the first place? Why did you leave that yard? Are we gonna run to ECMC, which is down the street? Or are you running away? And the police said that he was muttering, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." And then he said, "Motive and opportunity." Which is just such an odd statement. He was put into an induced coma, and he wasn't able, from my understanding, to be interviewed right away.
You know we're gonna interview Frank. Are there any questions you want us to ask him, or is there anything you want us to communicate to him?
I don't know what questions you want to ask him. Did you do it? And if he's going to say no, then prove it to me that you didn't do it. What the hell can he possibly tell you that's going to explain how gasoline got on my daughter and the fire happened and there's no lighters around her, and I don't know how he's going to explain that.
I am currently incarcerated at Green Haven Correctional Facility and serving 25 years to life. I was convicted of 2 counts of murder in the second, basically intentionally causing the death of another. I wasn't questioned by the police or investigators, and I didn't testify at trial. Up until now, I have never spoken publicly about the matter.
I absolutely did not start the fire. I know that with 100% certainty beyond all of the other things. One of the things I always do to show people, so this is the part of the worst of my burn, on the very back of my head. It creeps up through here. My body is 90% burned. My left hand is burned a lot more than my right hand. My face is way more burned on this side than the other. And I don't know how nobody... Another trauma I don't think I've dealt with yet. The best thing that I felt I could do was to tell everything that I have, the truth in the extent that I know it. As much that I know, as best that I can. I don't know if anyone should believe me. I don't know. It's not easy. I'm sure my family wouldn't want to believe that I would do it, and her family wouldn't want to believe she would do it. I mean, that's instinctive.
Things were pretty complicated at that point. She and I had started kind of going different directions.
I did ignore my phone a little bit that day, and I know that that was something Elizabeth absolutely hated. And I was not engaging because I knew she was just trying to get a rise out of me or get me to argue or something. she had started sending the messages angrily and telling me that she was putting my stuff outside. She did post across several platforms on social media. She had took several boxes and things outside. Elizabeth said something in a text message about how she was gonna burn and she was gonna burn my. And I remember being really upset that she said that. The statement reads, as we talked on the phone that night, Frank said she, Elizabeth, threw all my outside. My whole life is inside her house and garage. My bike and the tools that I got from my dad are in the house. He said, if my isn't there, I'll burn her whole fat family down. This has been obviously one of the focal points of the case. This was never something I said to Elizabeth. And beyond that, what he said is absolutely not verbatim what I said. What I actually said was something to the effect of, I swear to God, if she burns any of my stuff, I will take everything that her and I apologize because it's derogatory and it's offensive and I was upset. But what I said was, I will take everything that her and her fat family own out of that house and burn every possession they have. I swear, if she burns any of my stuff, they will all have nothing. Was pretty much what I said to that gentleman.
Then how did Elizabeth find out about that statement?
Well, that gentleman called her, and he must have expressed in some form or another what I said to him, because it was after their conversation that she started texting me things about starting fires and burning the house down.
We were able to get the full transcript of text messages between you two from the police file. Could you read from it?
Mm-hmm. Someone already thought your bike was trash. I'll bring everything else inside. Please don't burn our fat selves down. Good thing I paid for that bike. No love lost. Not a joke. Okay, feel free. Burn it down. K. And there was no messages in between.
But when is outgoing for you not a joke?
Huh? I don't know what I said before that.
You didn't say anything. That's the only thing you said back.
To be honest, it's the most I've been able to read them since this happened. I don't know. But I would presume I was referring to either she's not a joke or I'm not a joke.
Not that the fat family statement was not a joke?
Yeah, Again, it wasn't something I ever said directly to her. The very last thing I believe I said was, I love you, Mama, always.
That was to your mom.
That's
yeah.
my mom. Please don't do anything crazy.
It just seems very ominous that that would be the last thing that you texted.
That I texted my mother I love her? Always.
When you were about to leave for Elizabeth's house.
I mean, I could see how you'd read into that.
So how should we not read into it that way.
Right.
It was meant as a reassurance to my mother, not some kind of parting,
Not a goodbye.
tell you right. Which, like I said, I could see reading into that, but that's applying a bit much where there's very little. I don't know.
Are you ready to see
I'm
it?
ready. Do we have pills here? Like Tylenol? Huh? I need some. I need something. I'm just worried about the utter that's gonna come out of his mouth. Or God forbid the truth. Shouldn't be God for, if that's what God wants, then truth comes out. Okay.
Like my face is way more burned on this side than the other.
Wow, that doesn't even look like him. It also makes me think about what my daughter looked like. And she was worse than him. He got out. And he's got no nose. He's got no eyelashes, no eyelids, no ears, no mouth. And my daughter was burnt to a crisp.
But what I said was, I will take everything that her and her fat family own out of that house and burn every possession they have.
What he said and what was said to Elizabeth in court is the same friggin' thing. He took the big long thing of all the other things that he said and he condensed it down to, I'm gonna burn your fat family down. It's the same thing, but he did say it. This words from this text that are from his phone said, after my daughter says, please don't burn our fat selves down. And then he comes back with, not a joke. He's not calling her a joke. He's not calling him a joke. It's not a joke, I'm telling the truth. It is not a joke, I'm threatening you. And when I heard that in court, I started to cry. Just that cry of, oh my God, one more nail in the coffin. That was one of the last things the judge screamed at him. You threatened to burn the fat family's house down, and you did it.
I'm gonna ask you to read this text exchange between Frank and his mother.
I love you, Mama, always. Mama, where are you? I love you, son. Don't do anything crazy. Wow. It seems like she knows that it's ominous. He's like, I can see you thinking that this is ominous, but it sounds like even Mom thinks the sentence is ominous. Don't do anything crazy. Is that not ominous right there that Mom is saying? Don't do anything crazy. I love you. Where are you? It's the last message that's left on a suicide letter.
I want you to tell me the story from your side, from the moment that you got to her house that night.
She had made clear before I had got there that she was putting some of my stuff outside because she was convinced I was going to leave her.
Serious? You've been blowing
By the time I got there, everything was well back inside. When we went into the bedroom, it got very nasty very quickly. She was just saying things to be hurtful.
Talk about your son, shall we?
Shut the hell up!
And the very last thing that I remember saying to her, it was very personal. I don't know that it's something I want to share.
You said something that you don't want to share with us, but I think it's very hard for people
Yeah,
to fully understand.
I mentioned that she had suffered some abuse when she was younger. But basically, I insinuated that that was her own fault and that she deserved that happening to her. Obviously, being that it's the last thing I ever got to say to someone that I love is it's very difficult. And I certainly regret having said what I said, and it's rough.
My daughter was abused by one of her friends when she was 8 years old. But 8 years old, nobody, any of those ages deserves anything like that. And it's the last thing he ever said to her and how much he regrets it. Yeah, he's got a whole long time to think about it. To bring all that up as being your thing to hurt somebody for, you need to stop the relationship just with those words. Stop. It's gonna get worse. The words of hurt. I hate him. I absolutely just hate him to my core.
I said something really nasty, thinking that I had the upper hand and that I won that war of words. And I had turned to leave the room, but something hit me in the back of the head. And my ears were ringing, and after the first one, she hit me a couple more times. The next memory I have is waking up on the floor. And when I opened my eyes, at first I had to blink a couple times because it was super bright in the room. I couldn't even see all the way to the bed with how bright the fire was. I instantly sprung to my feet and realized I was aflame almost everywhere. So when I saw our room looking like that, Isabella's door was closed. Like the sinking feeling in my heart, I ran forward, I burst into her room. I wrapped her in a blanket and told her, we gotta get out of here, you gotta go downstairs now. When we made it to the bottom of the stairs, I told her, go with Grandma, and whatever you do, don't leave Grandma's side. I know I was significantly on fire again, and I was screaming to help me. Her brother Nicholas took the dishpan out of the sink and threw the big dishpan of water on me. And then I was, trying to roll on the ground in the kitchen and put myself out.
I don't believe him. Statements were made that, I hear that Frank carried Izzy out. And it's like, no, he didn't. Isabella got out of bed by herself from her testimony. She came downstairs by herself. Nicholas actually said that because Frank was on fire. And then Izzy came down afterwards. She doesn't remember him being on fire, but she does remember the fight. So she was getting up out of bed to come down to my room like I told her. And he came down the stairs on fire saying he looked like the Human Torch. How were you carrying a 7-year-old down the stairs? Ugh. Make up your mind. Tell the truth or don't.
you know how lighter fluid may have gotten in your kitchen?
In the kitchen?
Yeah.
Why?
Because the detectives said they found like one of those lighter fluid containers.
In the kitchen?
Yeah.
Where in the kitchen? Well, if I'm standing right in front of your sink doing dishes, it was right there. So where Frank fell.
Now, about that bottle of lighter fluid, the younger brother's statement, the police, they asked him, did you have lighter fluid in the kitchen? He said, absolutely not, never.
Yeah.
And then he said, well, where was it found? And they showed him right by the sink. And he said, well, that's right by where I put Frank out. So how do you explain, and also a piece of your coat being next to it?
Yeah.
How do you explain that?
I know for certain that it was not in my coat.
So how do you think it got in there?
When I came down the stairs, I was on fire head to toe. I believe I looked like the Human Torch. When I came into that area, I know I was flailing about before he threw water on me. So if it was anywhere near there, on the counter, on the table, on the chair, on the floor, which were all right near the doorway to go upstairs. So say if someone were to go outside and get that from the garage and come in, that would be where you would set it before you go upstairs.
Tell us why you think we should leave. Because the evidence is obviously very strong. So,
Yeah, like I said, I've been through a lot of it. And the way that they told the narrative at trial, if I was an outside observer and didn't know anything else other than what they presented me, I might see it that way. I might have thought, wow, what a terrible person. I can't believe that. How could he do such a thing? But it's always different when you have, I was there, and
There's no evidence to prove anything he has to say except for the dent on the back of his head that he says comes from being hit. There was nothing brought up in court about him getting hit in the head with anything. That probably would have been some good information on his side that I got hit in the head. I was knocked out cold. I woke up on fire. Really? You don't think that should have been evidence? The lighters on the stairs happens to have only his fingerprints on it. Yes, he's guilty. He made the choice to either leave that room, go get the gas, and go upstairs, and made that conscious choice. To then pour it on my daughter, he made the step to the final thing of lighting her on fire. That is what is evil to me. Is that moments that he decided to take every one of those steps. That is the evil path that was taken.
And why did you run and hide rather than going back in to help?
Yeah, I've been told by a number of people a number of times that they thought that expressed some semblance of guilt, or like maybe I was running away because I knew I did something wrong. I can't articulate the thoughts I was having at that time. They were more abstract than a definite thing. But after being so severely burned, I'm not surprised if I was a little disoriented. I remember kind of stumbling into the driveway. I don't think my thoughts were particularly coherent at that point. And I remember hearing the police radios and yelling like, over here, over here. And I just remember like trying to say, I need help. Getting loaded onto the gurney is like the last coherent memories I have. And then I woke up 3 months later, and was in a pretty severe condition. A lot of the burns that I suffered behind me are a lot worse than what I suffered in front of me.
The accelerant was poured on her by Frank, because there's nobody else around, from the evidence that I heard in court, and he lit her on fire, and then he got blowback from the fumes, and he was set on fire. What evil human being sets somebody on fire? Would I think Frank would do it? No. But the evidence is there. 12 people unanimously said he did it.
Who think you caught on fire?
I don't know if the actual ignition of the fire was purposeful or not. But after everything happened, part of me wonders if in her head, because of all the crazy things she said through text messages about fires, that she was the kind of person that was adamant that you not say anything you don't mean. Like, that don't point a gun at somebody unless you're gonna shoot philosophy. The thought that it might have been purposeful is terrifying to me. Even if she was responsible for this, I still love her. I'll always love her. I miss her very much, and even if I don't feel responsible for the fire itself, I certainly feel responsible for the path that led us there. There's a part of me that'll always feel responsible, you know? Every night before I go to bed, I say goodnight to Elizabeth and offer some kind of apology. I certainly hope it was an accident.
Wait a second. Are you friggin' kidding me? Shouldn't you be in jail, like being like super pissed off because you're innocent? And your girlfriend that you were supposedly breaking up with, like, set you on fire or hit you on the head with something? You should be in there being freaking miserable, not trying to freaking plead the case about, I think about Elizabeth every day and I still love her. I mean, it's frustrating.
What's frustrating about it?
It's just that little inkling that comes in there of hearing what he wants to say, trying to put it into the picture, and the puzzle pieces don't fit. They don't fit at all. He took my daughter. And that's why I said to the judge at the end, he took my daughter. She's gone. I don't want him to ever get out. I want him to die in jail. Looking in the mirror and seeing what his face looks like, seeing what his hands and stuff look like, and know how much more did she suffer while she was burning from the inside out. I live with this every single day. I never forget it. I needed to be her mother at the end and not be afraid of anything. And then I would rather have had her alive and not talk to me and away from the relationship than dead. She would have been alive for her daughter. And we could have made up. We can't make up. We can grow. He took her life away. She's gone, and he gets to live.
I mean, I killed 2 people. You don't come back from that, really.
You're saying it was David's idea to rob someone.
Yep.
That right there is what pisses me off, because that's a complete and utter fabrication. He's completely lying.
June 30th, 2009. The first light of dawn had not yet reached the dark waters of the Rideau Canal. The world around Kingston Mills locks seemed suspended between night and morning, caught in that strange hour when everything feels quieter than it should. The water barely moved. The air was cool. The stone walls surrounding the historic lock station stood silent, their reflections stretching across the black surface of the canal like shadows from another century. Nothing about that morning suggested that one of Canada's most disturbing family murder cases was about to emerge from the darkness beneath the water. At first, it looked like an accident. A car had somehow ended up submerged in the canal. It was the kind of tragedy that occasionally happened on remote roads. A wrong turn, a distracted driver, a terrible mistake. The sort of event that would make the local news for a day before fading into memory. But this was not an accident. Beneath the surface of the water sat a Nissan Sentra. Inside were 4 women, 4 members of the same family, 4 lives that had ended together during the same terrifying night. A 52-year-old mother, a 19-year-old daughter, a 17-year-old daughter, a 13-year-old daughter. As investigators began piecing together what had happened, something immediately felt wrong. The positions of the vehicle, the damage to the car, the inconsistencies in the family's story, the evidence scattered around the scene. Every answer seemed to create 2 new questions. How had the vehicle entered the water? Why were there signs of impact? Why did the story told by surviving family members fail to match the physical evidence? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what had happened inside that family long before the car ever reached the canal? The investigation that followed would reveal a world hidden behind the walls of a wealthy immigrant household. A world divided by fear, control, secrecy, and conflict. A world where 3 teenage girls dreamed about ordinary freedoms that millions of other Canadian teenagers took for granted. Going out with friends, choosing who they loved, deciding what kind of future they wanted. Dreams that would eventually place them on a collision course with the people who should have protected them. As detectives dug deeper, they discovered allegations of violence, stories of intimidation, desperate attempts by young women to escape strict control, arguments that had become increasingly dangerous, warnings that, in hindsight, sounded like cries for help. The more investigators learned, the less this case resembled a tragic accident. Instead, it began to look like something far darker, something planned, something personal, something that would force an entire nation to confront uncomfortable questions about family, power, culture, and the deadly consequences of obsession with so-called honor. The victims were not strangers. They were not targeted by a serial killer. They were not caught in the middle of a robbery gone wrong. According to prosecutors, they were targeted by the people who shared their home, the people who sat with them at dinner, the people who watched them grow up, the people they should have been able to trust. In the months that followed, investigators would uncover evidence suggesting that this was not a spontaneous act of violence. They would hear conversations that chilled even experienced detectives. They would reconstruct a timeline that painted a picture of growing tension inside the Shafia household. They would find indications that the victims had been viewed not as daughters, not as a wife, not as family members, but as sources of shame. The language used behind closed doors would shock the public. The motive alleged by prosecutors would spark fierce national debate. The trial would dominate headlines across Canada. And at the center of everything stood 4 women whose voices had been permanently silenced. One of them was a mother who had spent years trapped in a marriage she reportedly wanted to escape. 3 of them were daughters standing on the threshold between childhood and adulthood. Each of them had dreams. Each of them had fears. Each of them had a future that vanished beneath the water of the Rideau Canal. What makes this case especially haunting is not simply the brutality of the deaths. It is the betrayal that sits at the center of the story. Most people fear danger from the outside world. A stranger in the dark. A criminal lurking in the shadows. A threat arriving unexpectedly. But what happens when the danger is already inside the home? What happens when the people responsible for enforcing the rules become the greatest source of fear? What happens when love becomes tangled with control, obedience, and punishment? The answers would emerge slowly. Witness statements, telephone records, forensic evidence, secretly recorded conversations. Piece by piece, investigators assembled a narrative that seemed almost impossible to believe. A family that had traveled across continents in search of a better life. Children growing up between two worlds. A father determined to preserve his authority. A mother struggling under years of domination. Teenage daughters longing for independence. And beneath the surface, tensions that had been building for years. To outsiders, the Shafia family often appeared successful. They lived comfortably. They had resources. They had opportunities. From a distance, they looked like a family that had achieved the immigrant dream. Yet appearances can be deceiving. Behind closed doors, according to evidence later presented in court, a different reality existed. One filled with conflict. One filled with resentment. One filled with fear. By the time investigators began uncovering the truth, it was already too late for the 4 victims. The canal had already claimed them. The questions they might have answered would never be asked. The futures they imagined would never arrive. Only fragments remained. Fragments preserved in photographs. Fragments remembered by friends. Fragments found in diaries, conversations, and memories. And as those fragments came together, a devastating picture emerged. A picture of young women caught between expectation and freedom, between obedience and independence, between the traditions of the past and the possibilities of a new life. The story you are about to hear is not merely a murder investigation. It is a story about power. It is a story about control. It is a story about fear hidden behind the image of family unity. Most importantly, it is a story about 4 victims whose lives deserve to be remembered for more than the way they died. Because before they became names in a courtroom, before they became headlines across Canada, before they became symbols in a national debate, they were people. They laughed. They argued. They hoped. They dreamed. And on a summer night in 2009, those dreams came to an end in the dark waters of the Rideau Canal. The truth of what happened there would take years to fully uncover. When it finally emerged, it would leave investigators, jurors, journalists, and ordinary Canadians asking the same haunting question. How could a family become the scene of such unimaginable violence? To answer that question, we have to go back to the beginning, long before the submerged car, long before the police investigation, long before the courtroom battles, back to the origins of the Shafia family itself, back to the lives of the women whose voices still echo through this case, and back to the hidden tensions that were quietly building toward a tragedy no one could stop. To understand how 4 members of the same family ended up trapped inside a sinking car in the Rideau Canal, we first have to travel thousands of miles away from Canada. Long before police divers descended into dark water near Kingston. Long before detectives examined shattered headlights and conflicting statements. Long before the nation learned the names Zainab, Sahar, Geethi, and Rona. The roots of this tragedy were already growing. Quietly. Slowly. Deep inside a family shaped by migration, authority, fear, and competing visions of what life should be. The Shafia family originated in Afghanistan, a country that for decades had endured political instability, war, displacement, and social upheaval. Like countless families forced to navigate uncertain times, the Shafias sought opportunities beyond their homeland. Their journey eventually led them through several countries before they settled in Canada, a nation that represented safety, prosperity, and a chance for a new beginning. From the outside, the story appeared inspiring. It was the kind of immigrant success story many people admire. Mohammed Shafia had built considerable wealth through business. He was not a struggling newcomer arriving with nothing. By the time the family settled in Montreal in 2007, they enjoyed financial security that many immigrant families spend generations trying to achieve. They lived comfortably. They owned expensive vehicles. Their home reflected a level of success that suggested stability and opportunity. To neighbors, acquaintances, and people who only observed from a distance, the family often appeared fortunate. Yet wealth has never guaranteed peace. Behind attractive homes and successful businesses, private conflicts can grow unnoticed. Sometimes money conceals problems rather than solving them. Sometimes it builds walls thick enough to keep outsiders from seeing what is happening inside. The Shafia household was unusual even before arriving in Canada. Mohammed Shafia lived within a polygamous family structure. His first wife was Rona Amir Mohammed. His second wife was Tuba Yehya. The arrangement created a complicated family dynamic that carried emotional tensions of its own. Family relationships were layered with hierarchy, expectations, loyalties, and competition for approval. For years, those dynamics remained largely hidden from public view. When the family arrived in Canada, they entered a society very different from the one they had known before. Montreal offered freedoms that many teenagers naturally embrace. Young people socialized openly. Boys and girls attended school together. Dating was common. Friendships formed without strict parental supervision. Individual choice was often encouraged. For many immigrant families, adapting to these cultural differences can be challenging. Parents frequently struggle to balance the traditions they value with the realities of raising children in a new environment. Most families navigate these tensions without violence. Arguments occur. Rules evolve. Compromises are made. But according to evidence later presented in court, compromise was becoming increasingly difficult inside the Shafia household. Mohammed Shafia reportedly maintained deeply conservative views regarding family honor, obedience, and female behavior. He expected strict adherence to his authority. He expected respect. He expected compliance. The problem was that his daughters were growing up. And growing up means asking questions. It means developing opinions. It means imagining futures that parents cannot completely control. Zainab, Sahar, and Geethi were not merely daughters. They were young people trying to discover who they wanted to become. That process can be complicated for any teenager. For teenagers living between two cultures, it can become even more difficult. At school, they encountered classmates whose lives followed different rules. They saw girls choosing their own clothing. They saw young women pursuing relationships. They saw friends making plans for university, careers, and independence. Each new experience expanded the gap between the world outside the home and the world inside it. The conflict did not appear overnight. It emerged gradually. A disagreement here. An argument there. A restriction imposed. A boundary challenged. A punishment delivered. A resentment carried forward. Month after month, year after year, tensions accumulated. One of the most significant conflicts involved Zainab, the eldest daughter among the victims. As a teenager approaching adulthood, she wanted many of the same things other young women wanted. She dreamed about her future. She formed relationships. She imagined a life that belonged to her. At some point, she developed a romantic relationship with a young man of Pakistani origin. To many families, such a relationship would have been unremarkable. To Mohammed Shafia, according to prosecutors, it represented a profound challenge to his authority and expectations. The reaction was intense. The relationship became a source of escalating conflict. Family members later described arguments and confrontations surrounding the issue. The disagreement was not simply about dating. It was about control, about who had the right to make decisions, about whether daughters could choose their own paths. The more Zainab pushed toward independence, the more friction appeared inside the home. And she was not alone. Sahar was also growing into her own identity. Friends later described intelligent, energetic young women who wanted opportunities available to other Canadian teenagers. They were navigating the difficult terrain between respecting their family and seeking personal freedom. Then there was Geethi, only 13 years old, still a child in many ways. Yet even she was beginning to experience the atmosphere surrounding her. Children often recognize fear long before they fully understand its causes. They notice changes in tone. They notice tension during dinner. They notice arguments behind closed doors. They notice when family members seem afraid. And fear, when it becomes part of everyday life, can shape an entire childhood. At the center of these growing conflicts stood another victim whose story is sometimes overshadowed by those of the younger women. Rona Amir Muhammad, the first wife, the mother, a woman who had spent years living within a structure where power was concentrated elsewhere. According to evidence presented during the investigation, Rona's life was marked by isolation and control. She reportedly wanted greater independence. Some accounts suggested she had discussed separation or divorce. Others described a woman trapped between loyalty to her children and fear of the consequences of challenging family authority. Her position was extraordinarily difficult. She lived inside the same household. She witnessed the growing conflict involving her daughters. She understood the expectations imposed upon them. And according to prosecutors, She increasingly sided with the young women seeking more freedom. That support may have deepened the resentment directed toward her. As months passed, concerns about the family's internal dynamics began surfacing beyond the walls of the home. There were reports of domestic conflict. There were allegations of controlling behavior. There were indications that some of the daughters felt frightened. The details varied, but a pattern was beginning to emerge. These were not isolated disagreements. They reflected a deeper struggle over identity, independence, and power. To outsiders, however, the situation remained difficult to see clearly. The family continued functioning. Children attended school. Daily life moved forward. The household presented an image of normalcy. Yet normalcy can be deceptive. Many abusive environments appear ordinary from the outside. Neighbors hear laughter through open windows. Families pose for photographs. Vacations are taken. Birthdays are celebrated. Meanwhile, tensions continue building beneath the surface. By 2009, those tensions appeared to be reaching a critical point. The daughters were becoming older, more independent, more confident in expressing their wishes. The gap between what they wanted and what was expected of them continued widening. The atmosphere inside the family grew increasingly strained. According to later testimony and investigative findings, discussions about honor became intertwined with anger and humiliation. The concept of family reputation carried enormous emotional weight. Actions that many Canadians would view as ordinary teenage behavior were interpreted very differently within the household. Relationships, friendships, personal choices, each became potential sources of conflict. What makes this period particularly chilling is that signs of danger already existed. The tragedy did not emerge from nowhere. There were warnings, moments when people expressed concern, moments when fear surfaced, moments that, viewed in retrospect, seem loaded with significance. Yet hindsight often creates clarity unavailable in real time. People rarely know they are witnessing the beginning of a future murder case. Friends hear complaints and assume families will work through their problems. Teachers observe tension and hope circumstances improve. Relatives avoid interfering. Life continues, until suddenly it doesn't. During the summer of 2009, the Shafia family embarked on what appeared to be an ordinary trip. They traveled through parts of Ontario, including the Niagara Falls region. Tourists filled the roads. Families visited attractions. Children took photographs. Hotels welcomed travelers from around the world. To anyone observing from a distance, the Shafias looked like another family enjoying a summer journey. No one standing nearby could have known that several members of that family would soon be dead. No one could have predicted that investigators would later scrutinize every mile of that trip. No one could have imagined that the vacation would become one of the final chapters in a story already moving toward catastrophe. As June drew to a close, the family began making its way back toward Quebec. The highways stretched ahead. Cars moved steadily through the warm Canadian summer. The future still appeared open, at least on the surface. But beneath that appearance, years of conflict, resentment, control, and fear were approaching a breaking point. The stage had already been set. The relationships had already fractured. The anger had already taken root. And somewhere within those final days of June 2009, events were unfolding that would soon place 4 women on a path toward the dark waters of the Rideau Canal. The world did not know it yet, but one of Canada's most shocking family murder cases was only hours away. In many true crime stories, victims are introduced through the details of their deaths. Their names appear in headlines. Their photographs flash across television screens. Their final moments become the focus of public attention. But if we only remember people for the way they died, we lose sight of who they were while they lived. Before they became victims in one of Canada's most disturbing family murder cases, Zainab Shafia, Sahar Shafia, Geethi Shafia, and Rona Amir Muhammad were individuals with dreams, fears, personalities, and hopes for the future. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in the summer of 2009, we must first understand the women whose lives were taken. The eldest of the daughters was 19-year-old Zainab Shafia. At 19, life is often filled with possibilities. It is an age balanced between adolescence and adulthood, an age when many young people begin imagining what the next chapter of their lives might look like. University, relationships, independence, careers, travel, love, freedom. Friends and people who knew Zainab described a young woman who wanted more control over her own future. She was living in Canada, surrounded by opportunities that seemed increasingly within reach. Every day she could see classmates making decisions about their lives. She could see young women building identities separate from their families. She could see a future that looked different from the one planned for her. Like many teenagers and young adults, she wanted to choose whom she loved. That desire eventually became one of the central sources of conflict inside the Shafia household. According to evidence later presented in court, Zainab's relationship with a young man deeply angered her father. What many people would consider a normal part of growing up became something far more dangerous inside her family environment. But reducing Zainab's story to a romantic relationship would be unfair. She was much more than that. She was a young woman trying to discover herself, trying to balance family expectations with personal aspirations, trying to navigate the complicated reality of growing up between cultures. For children of immigrant families, identity is often not a simple matter. Home and school can feel like different worlds operating under different rules. One set of values waits behind the front door. Another exists everywhere outside it. Many young people learn to move between those worlds. Some do so successfully. Others find themselves trapped between conflicting expectations. For Zainab, that struggle appeared to become increasingly painful. As she grew older, her desire for independence reportedly intensified. Arguments with family members became more frequent. Restrictions felt heavier. Expectations felt harder to accept. Yet despite those pressures, she continued imagining a life of her own. A future beyond fear. A future beyond control. A future she would never be allowed to reach. Then there was Sahar Shafia, 17 years old. An age filled with energy, curiosity, and possibility. Unlike adults who often accept the limits placed upon them, teenagers still believe change is possible. They imagine different versions of themselves. They picture lives they have not yet lived. Sahar was approaching adulthood. She was beginning to form her own opinions about the world. She was surrounded by classmates whose lives reflected freedoms she wanted for herself. The transition from childhood to adulthood is rarely smooth. Even in loving families, conflict can emerge. Teenagers challenge rules. Parents worry about influence and safety. Arguments become part of daily life. But there is a difference between ordinary family conflict and fear. According to evidence gathered during the investigation, tensions inside the household extended far beyond typical disagreements. For Sahar, every step toward independence appeared to create new friction. Every effort to express herself risked provoking anger. Every glimpse of freedom carried consequences. Imagine being 17 years old and watching your peers prepare for adulthood while feeling uncertain whether you will ever be allowed to make your own choices. Imagine wanting ordinary experiences that most teenagers take for granted. A conversation with friends, a social outing, the ability to decide your future. Simple freedoms become extraordinary when they are denied. What makes Sahar's story especially heartbreaking is how close she was to adulthood, how close she was to making decisions for herself, how close she was to stepping into a future she had spent years imagining. That future disappeared before it could begin. The youngest daughter among the victims was Geethi Shafia, only 13 years old. When people hear about this case, Geethi's age often stands out immediately. 13. Still young enough to be considered a child. Still attending middle school. Still discovering who she was. Children possess a remarkable ability to find joy even in difficult circumstances. They laugh easily. They dream freely. They believe tomorrow will arrive just as it always has. Yet children are also extraordinarily sensitive to tension. They notice raised voices. They notice slammed doors. They notice tears. They notice fear. Even when adults think they are hiding problems, children often sense far more than anyone realizes. Geethi was growing up in an environment where conflict had become increasingly common. Whether she fully understood the reasons behind it is impossible to know. What we do know is that she was caught in circumstances entirely beyond her control. She did not create the family tensions. She did not shape the conflicts surrounding honor and authority. She did not decide the arguments that consumed the household. She simply lived inside them. There is something uniquely tragic about the death of a child because children represent possibility. Their lives feel unfinished in a way that is difficult to describe. Every future remains open. Every dream remains possible. Every path remains unexplored. At 13 years old, Geethi had not yet become the person she would one day be. The world would never have the chance to find out. Then there was the fourth victim, the woman whose life connected all the others. Rona Amir Muhammad. Mother. First wife. A woman whose story is often overshadowed by the deaths of her daughters. Rona was 52 years old when she died. She had spent decades living within family structures defined by unequal power dynamics. By the time the family settled in Canada, she had already experienced years of hardship, displacement, and dependence. While her daughters dreamed about the future, Rona was confronting the reality of her present. According to evidence later examined during the investigation, she reportedly wanted greater freedom for herself. There were indications she wished to separate from Muhammad Shafia. There were suggestions she no longer wanted to remain trapped within circumstances that had defined much of her adult life. Leaving an unhappy marriage is never simple. For someone living within an environment shaped by control, fear, and dependence, it can feel nearly impossible. Financial concerns create obstacles. Family pressures create obstacles. Cultural expectations create obstacles. Fear itself becomes an obstacle. Yet evidence suggested that Rona was beginning to imagine another life. Perhaps she pictured a quieter future. Perhaps she imagined living independently. Perhaps she hoped her daughters would enjoy opportunities she never had. Those hopes would never become reality. One of the most haunting aspects of this case is the relationship between Rona and her daughters. The four victims were not isolated individuals connected only by tragedy. They were a family within a family. A mother and three daughters bound together by shared experiences, shared fears, shared hopes, shared struggles. As tensions increased inside the household, that bond appears to have grown stronger. According to prosecutors, Rona increasingly supported her daughters as they sought greater independence. In many ways, she represented an emotional bridge between generations. She understood the traditional expectations imposed by the family. She also understood the desires of her daughters. Standing between those worlds likely came with enormous emotional cost. History is filled with stories of parents who sacrifice for their children. Mothers who endure hardship so their sons and daughters might have better lives. Mothers who absorb pain quietly while protecting those they love. When investigators later reconstructed the dynamics inside the Shafia household, they encountered evidence suggesting that Rona often found herself in precisely that role. Trying to protect, trying to support, trying to survive. The tragedy becomes even more painful when viewed through this lens. These four victims shared more than a family name. They shared a common struggle. Each in her own way was confronting limitations imposed upon her life. Each was seeking some form of freedom. Each was trying to move toward a future that felt increasingly difficult to reach. And perhaps that is what makes this story resonate so deeply with people around the world. The victims were not famous. They were not wealthy celebrities. They were not public figures. They were ordinary women facing conflicts many people can recognize, even if the circumstances were unique. A daughter seeking independence. A teenager longing for acceptance. A child caught in family turmoil. A mother hoping for a better life. Their dreams were ordinary. Their hopes were ordinary. Their fears were ordinary. That ordinary humanity makes their deaths extraordinarily difficult to process. Because when people hear this story, they often imagine themselves in similar situations. Parents imagine their daughters. Teenagers imagine their own struggles for independence. Mothers imagine the burden of protecting their children. The victims become relatable. And once that happens, the tragedy feels personal. By the summer of 2009, all four women were living beneath the same roof while navigating increasingly dangerous tensions. To outsiders, they remained a family. They traveled together. They appeared together. They continued moving through daily life. Yet beneath the surface, fear and conflict were growing stronger. The daughters were becoming more independent. Rona was reportedly becoming more supportive of that independence. The divide inside the household was widening. No one outside the family could fully see what was happening. No one could know how close the situation was to catastrophe. What they could not see was that the women at the center of this story were already living with pressures that would soon explode into violence. The dreams they carried, the futures they imagined, the lives they hoped to build. All of it would collide with forces determined to stop them. And as June 2009 approached its final days, the lives of Zainab, Sahar, Geethi, and Rona were moving toward a night from which none of them would return. A night that would transform them from daughters and a mother into victims. A night that would leave an entire country searching for answers. And a night whose horrifying events were only beginning to unfold. Tourists crowded the roads near Niagara Falls. Families took photographs beside the rushing water. Hotels buzzed with summer travelers. Cars moved steadily across Ontario highways under long daylight hours and warm evening skies. To anyone passing them on the road, the Shafia family looked unremarkable. Parents, children, luggage, conversations, and the familiar rhythm of a family returning home after a vacation. But appearances can hide terrible things. Inside the Shafia family, tensions had been building for years. Arguments over freedom, relationships, obedience, and control had hardened into something more dangerous. By the time the family began the drive back toward Quebec, the atmosphere was already strained. Investigators would later believe that the violence which followed was not spontaneous. It was the culmination of conflicts that had been growing quietly behind closed doors. The key figures still alive at the end of that trip were Mohammed Shafia, his second wife Tuba Yehya, his son Hamed Shafia, and the 4 women who would soon die: Rona, Zainab, Sahar, and Geethi. The exact conversations inside the vehicles that night are lost forever. No recording captured the arguments. No witness heard every word. But the evidence later gathered by police and prosecutors suggested a family moving through the final stage of a long, bitter struggle. Sometime during the night of June 29th and the early hours of June 30th, the Nissan Sentra carrying the 4 women ended up at Kingston Mills Locks near the Rideau Canal. What happened next became the central question of the investigation. The family's initial explanation was simple: an accident. According to their account, the Nissan somehow rolled into the canal. A tragic misfortune. A terrible mistake during a late-night stop near the water. The kind of explanation that, at first glance, sounds plausible enough to delay suspicion. But physical evidence rarely cares about stories. When investigators examined the scene, they found details that immediately raised alarms. The position of the car did not match a simple roll into the water. The damage suggested impact before the vehicle submerged. Fragments of broken headlights were recovered, and forensic analysis linked some of them to the family's Lexus SUV. That discovery changed everything. Because if pieces from the Lexus were embedded in or near the Nissan, then the Nissan had likely been struck by another vehicle before entering the canal. And if the Lexus had struck it, the question became unavoidable. Who was driving and why? The emerging theory was chilling. Prosecutors would later argue that the Nissan had been intentionally rammed and pushed into the water. The women inside either drowned after the vehicle submerged or were already incapacitated before it entered the canal. Imagine the terror of those final moments. A dark roadside near the canal. Confusion turning into fear. A sudden collision. The sound of metal against metal. Water rushing in. Windows failing. Panic spreading through the car. For women trapped together as the vehicle sank into darkness. We cannot know exactly what they experienced in their final minutes. But drowning inside a submerged vehicle is one of the most terrifying deaths imaginable. Water rises quickly. Doors become impossible to open. Air disappears. The cabin turns into a prison. For investigators, the scene suggested not chaos, but intent. The Nissan did not appear to have wandered accidentally into the canal. The evidence pointed toward force, planning, and control. Another disturbing detail soon emerged. The women were traveling separately from some other family members. The family's movements that night became increasingly difficult to reconcile with the accident narrative. Timelines did not align cleanly. Statements changed. Certain details appeared rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Detectives began reconstructing the family's route hour by hour. Where had they stopped? Who was in which vehicle? When were the women last seen alive? Why did the story keep shifting? As police pressed for answers, inconsistencies multiplied. One version of events would change slightly in a later interview. Another detail would contradict physical evidence. Small discrepancies accumulated into a pattern that investigators found deeply suspicious. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued examining the vehicles and the canal scene. The evidence increasingly supported the conclusion that the Nissan had been struck deliberately. This was no longer being treated as a traffic accident. It was becoming a homicide investigation. For the surviving family members, the pressure intensified rapidly. Detectives were no longer asking routine questions about a tragedy. They were probing motives, movements, and relationships. And the deeper they looked into the family dynamic, the darker the picture became. Investigators uncovered reports of severe conflict inside the household. They learned about disputes over dating and independence. They heard allegations of controlling behavior and violence. They discovered that the victims had expressed fear before their deaths. The theory taking shape was devastating. The women may have been killed because they were viewed as having brought shame upon the family. That possibility transformed the case from a mysterious drowning into something far more disturbing, a potential honor killing carried out within the family itself. Publicly, the surviving relatives maintained that the deaths were accidental. But privately, detectives were assembling evidence that suggested planning and intent. One of the most significant developments came from surveillance and recorded conversations. Authorities obtained secretly recorded discussions involving family members. In those conversations, investigators heard language that prosecutors would later describe as revealing deep hostility toward the victims. The recordings did not sound like the grief of people mourning a sudden accident. They sounded, prosecutors argued, like the words of people consumed by anger and resentment. As the evidence mounted, police prepared to act. On July 23, 2009, less than a month after the bodies were discovered, authorities arrested Mohammed Shafia, Tuba Yehya, and Hamed Shafia. All three were charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. The arrest stunned Canada. A father, a mother, a son, accused of murdering the wife and daughters inside their own family. News coverage spread rapidly across the country. The details were so disturbing that many people initially struggled to believe them. The image of a successful immigrant family collapsed almost overnight, replaced by allegations of violence, control, and calculated murder. But the investigation was far from over. Detectives still needed to prove exactly what had happened that night. They needed to establish who was present, who drove which vehicle, how the collision occurred, whether the victims were conscious when the car entered the water, whether the act had been planned in advance. Forensic experts analyzed damage patterns on the vehicles. Divers documented the canal scene. Investigators reviewed phone records, travel timelines, and witness statements. Prosecutors worked to transform a disturbing theory into a case that could survive courtroom scrutiny. The emotional weight of the case was enormous. 4 women were dead. 3 generations of a family had been destroyed. And the surviving relatives were now accusing one another, changing stories, or retreating behind legal defenses. At the center of everything remained the same haunting question. What happened during those final hours beside the Rideau Canal? Some investigators believe the plan may have involved staging the deaths as an accident from the beginning. A submerged car could appear tragic but ordinary. Late-night driving accidents happen. Water obscures evidence. Panic and confusion complicate timelines. But the scene at Kingston Mills locks refused to cooperate with that narrative. The shattered headlight pieces, the impact evidence, the contradictions. The canal had preserved too many clues. As summer turned toward autumn, the case grew into one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in Canada. It touched on domestic violence, cultural conflict, immigration, patriarchy, and the lethal consequences of obsession with family honor. Commentators debated terminology. Communities argued about representation and stigma. Journalists descended on Kingston and Montreal searching for details. Yet amid the national debate, it was easy to forget the human reality beneath the headlines. Zainab was 19. Sahar was 17. Geethi was 13. Rona was 52. Their lives ended together in a submerged car during the darkest hours before dawn. Whatever arguments had erupted inside the family, whatever resentments had accumulated over years, whatever plans were made or denied, the result was the same. For women never came home. And as investigators continued assembling evidence, the possibility grew stronger that the people responsible were not strangers lurking in the night. They were members of the same family, the same household, the same journey. The discovery began in darkness. Not the dramatic darkness of a storm or a violent night filled with thunder and rain. It was something quieter than that. The kind of darkness that exists just before dawn, when the world seems suspended between sleeping and waking. The air over Kingston Mills locks carried the cool stillness of an Ontario summer morning. The historic stone structures stood silent beside the Rideau Canal. Water moved slowly through the lock system, reflecting fragments of moonlight and the faint glow of distant lamps. For generations, the canal had witnessed countless ordinary mornings. Boaters passing through, workers beginning their shifts, tourists arriving to explore one of Canada's most famous waterways. Nothing about June 30th, 2009 appeared unusual, at least not at first. Then someone noticed the vehicle. From a distance, it was little more than an unnatural shape beneath the water's surface. The canal was calm enough that objects below could sometimes be seen through the dark water. At first glance, it may have looked like debris or perhaps a vehicle that had somehow slipped into the canal. Whatever assumptions existed during those first moments quickly disappeared once authorities were notified. Emergency responders arrived. The situation immediately became serious. A submerged vehicle always raises urgent questions. Was someone trapped inside? Had a recent accident occurred? Could survivors still be rescued? Every minute mattered. The area near the canal became increasingly active as emergency personnel assessed the scene. The peaceful atmosphere of dawn gave way to flashing lights, radios, and cautious movements along the water's edge. Responders focused on the vehicle resting beneath the surface. As recovery efforts began, nobody yet understood the full significance of what lay underwater. The vehicle was eventually identified as a Nissan Sentra. When crews worked to bring it from the canal, the mood shifted dramatically. There were occupants inside. Not one, not two, four. 4 female bodies. 4 members of the same family. The realization sent shockwaves through everyone present. Even experienced emergency personnel are affected by scenes involving multiple victims. There is something uniquely heartbreaking about discovering an entire group of family members together in death. The image stays with investigators long after the scene has ended. As the vehicle emerged from the water, dripping canal water and coated with mud and debris, the scale of the tragedy became impossible to ignore. Inside were 52-year-old Rona Amir Mohammed, 19-year-old Zainab Shafia, 17-year-old Sahar Shafia, and 13-year-old Geethi Shafia. 3 daughters. Their mother. All dead. At that moment, however, investigators still did not know why. The most obvious explanation was an accident. Cars occasionally enter bodies of water for many reasons. Drivers become disoriented. Mechanical failures occur. Visibility is poor. Wrong turns happen. The possibility seemed reasonable enough. Yet crime scene investigators are trained to notice details that others might overlook. And almost immediately, certain details began attracting attention. The location of the vehicle did not entirely fit expectations. The position of the Nissan raised questions. The surrounding evidence raised questions. Even before a complete forensic examination, some investigators felt uneasy. Experienced detectives often describe a feeling when something about a scene does not fit. It is not intuition in a supernatural sense. Rather, it comes from years of exposure to accidents, suicides, homicides, and unexplained deaths. Patterns become familiar. Deviations become noticeable. The Kingston Mills scene contained deviations. As forensic specialists examined the vehicle, they documented every detail carefully. Photographs, measurements, damage patterns, tire positions, impact points. Every piece of information mattered. The canal itself became part of the investigation. Divers searched surrounding areas for evidence that might have been lost during the vehicle's entry into the water. Small fragments can reveal enormous truths. A broken piece of plastic, a damaged light housing, a shard of glass. Any one of them can transform an entire case. That principle proved especially important here. During the examination of the scene, investigators discovered fragments associated with vehicle damage. Initially, the significance of those fragments was unclear. But as forensic analysis progressed, a troubling picture began to emerge. The Nissan showed evidence suggesting it had been struck. Not merely damaged during its descent into the canal. Struck. The distinction was critical. If the car had entered the water due to driver error, investigators would expect certain damage patterns. If another vehicle had collided with it beforehand, different patterns would emerge. Experts began analyzing those patterns meticulously. Vehicle collision reconstruction is a science built on physics, engineering, and observation. Every dent, scrape, and fracture tells a story. The angle of impact, the force involved, the sequence of events. Cars do not lie. They preserve evidence long after human memory becomes unreliable. As specialists studied the Nissan, the accident theory started to weaken. Meanwhile, detectives began interviewing surviving family members. The family explained that the deaths were the result of a tragic accident. It sounded plausible enough on the surface. A family vacation, a late-night stop, a vehicle somehow ending up in the canal. Terrible but not impossible. Yet interviews quickly revealed inconsistencies. Different versions of events emerged. Certain details failed to align. Timelines became difficult to reconcile. Statements that should have matched did not. Investigators paid close attention. Contradictions alone do not prove guilt. Grief can affect memory. Trauma can create confusion. Witnesses often remember events differently. However, when inconsistencies combine with suspicious physical evidence, they become much more significant. That was exactly what was happening. The deeper detectives looked, the more questions appeared. Why were family members traveling in separate vehicles? What exactly happened during the final hours before the deaths? Who was present near the canal? Why did the physical evidence seem inconsistent with the explanation being offered? Each answer generated new mysteries. Meanwhile, autopsies were conducted. Medical examiners worked carefully to determine causes of death and identify any injuries that might reveal what occurred before the vehicle entered the water. Forensic pathology often provides crucial pieces of a puzzle. Bodies can reveal evidence invisible to witnesses. They can expose violence, restraint, trauma, or other factors hidden beneath surface appearances. Investigators awaited those findings while continuing to reconstruct the timeline. Hour by hour, minute by minute, the family's journey through Ontario became the subject of intense scrutiny. Where had they traveled? Who had spoken to whom? What routes had they taken? What stops had they made? Every movement mattered. The case was evolving rapidly. Within days, it no longer resembled a straightforward accident investigation. Reporters began taking interest. News organizations learned that 4 women from the same family had died under unusual circumstances. Questions spread quickly. Public curiosity grew. At first, coverage focused on the tragedy itself. A mother and 3 daughters dead. A family devastated. But as more information emerged, the narrative began changing. The discovery of suspicious vehicle damage attracted attention. So did reports of tension within the household. Then investigators uncovered something even more troubling. Evidence suggested that the victims had experienced significant family conflict before their deaths. Stories surfaced regarding strict control, arguments over relationships, disputes involving independence, concerns about safety. The victims were no longer viewed simply as passengers in a tragic accident. They were becoming central figures in a much darker story. For detectives, this represented a critical shift. Every homicide investigation begins with a fundamental question: who benefits from the victim's death? When investigators examined the lives of Rona, Zainab, Sahar, and Geethi, they discovered a household struggling under years of conflict. The daughters wanted increasing freedom. The mother reportedly supported them. Other family members strongly opposed those changes. Suddenly, motive entered the picture. And once motive appears alongside suspicious evidence, investigators begin looking much more closely at everyone involved. The canal itself continued yielding clues. Vehicle damage analysis became increasingly important. Experts eventually concluded that the Nissan had likely been struck by another vehicle before entering the water. That conclusion transformed the entire investigation. If true, then the deaths were not accidental. Someone had interacted with that vehicle before it submerged. Someone had influenced the chain of events leading to 4 deaths. The search for that someone intensified. Behind the scenes, detectives assembled evidence piece by piece. Witness interviews, forensic reports, vehicle examinations, travel records, family history. What emerged was not a random tragedy. It was the outline of a potential murder case. And perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all was where the evidence seemed to be leading. Not toward strangers. Not toward criminals lurking in the shadows. Not toward unknown attackers. Toward the family itself. The possibility was almost unthinkable. Yet investigators could not ignore what the evidence suggested. The people closest to the victims were becoming the focus of scrutiny. The same people who claimed to be grieving. The same people who had traveled with them. The same people who insisted the deaths were accidental. As June became July, the investigation entered a new phase. The discovery at Kingston Mills Locks had started as a tragic recovery operation. Now it was becoming one of the most significant homicide investigations in modern Canadian history. The quiet canal that had seemed so peaceful before dawn was no longer simply a location. It had become a crime scene. And somewhere within the evidence hidden beneath the water, among shattered fragments of metal and glass, lay the first clues that would eventually expose a devastating truth. A truth that would shatter an entire family. A truth that would shock a nation. And a truth that investigators were only beginning to uncover. In the days following the discovery at Kingston Mills Locks, investigators found themselves standing at a crossroads. One path led toward a tragic accident. The other pointed toward murder. At first glance, both possibilities remained open. For women had died inside a submerged vehicle. The surviving family members insisted it had been an accident. Yet the physical evidence refused to cooperate with that explanation. Every forensic report seemed to pull the investigation further away from misfortune and closer to something deliberate. The challenge facing detectives was enormous. Unlike many homicide cases, there was no obvious crime scene filled with blood, fingerprints, and eyewitnesses. The central event had occurred near water, one of the most destructive environments for evidence. The victims were dead. The only surviving people who knew exactly what had happened were the individuals whose accounts were already raising suspicion. Investigators would need patience. They would need science. And most importantly, they would need to separate truth from deception. The first step involved reconstructing the family's movements in the hours leading up to the deaths. Where had everyone been? Who traveled in which vehicle? What conversations had occurred? What stops had been made along the route? Detectives approached the timeline like archaeologists excavating an ancient site. Every receipt, every phone call, every witness statement became a fragment of a larger picture. Initially, the family's version of events seemed relatively straightforward. They described the deaths as a terrible accident involving the Nissan Sentra. But when investigators compared individual accounts, cracks began appearing. Small inconsistencies emerged. Times did not match. Details shifted. Descriptions changed. One contradiction alone means little. Human memory is imperfect. Traumatic events often create confusion. But when contradictions begin multiplying, investigators pay attention. That was exactly what happened here. Each interview produced new questions. Why did certain family members remember events differently? Why did portions of the timeline remain unclear? Why were there discrepancies regarding vehicle locations and movements? The more detectives pressed, the less comfortable they became with the accident theory. Meanwhile, forensic specialists continued analyzing the physical evidence recovered from the scene. One of the most important discoveries involved the damaged headlights. Fragments recovered near the submerged Nissan were examined carefully. Experts compared them against the family's Lexus SUV. The results proved significant. Some fragments matched the Lexus. This was not supposed to happen in an accident scenario. If the Nissan had simply rolled into the canal on its own, why was there evidence linking it to damage from another family vehicle? The findings suggested contact. Impact. A collision between the two vehicles. And if a collision occurred, investigators needed to determine whether it had been accidental or intentional. Vehicle reconstruction experts became crucial members of the investigative team. Using damage patterns, impact angles, and physical measurements, they attempted to recreate the final moments before the Nissan entered the water. Their conclusions increasingly challenged the family's narrative. The evidence suggested the Nissan had been struck before it submerged. That conclusion dramatically altered the direction of the investigation. Now detectives were no longer asking whether another vehicle had been involved. They were asking who had been driving it. The answer seemed obvious. The family's Lexus. The same Lexus connected to surviving members of the household. The same Lexus whose damaged components appeared connected to the Nissan. As suspicion intensified, detectives widened their examination of the family's history. What they discovered painted an increasingly troubling picture. Friends, acquaintances, and individuals familiar with the family described significant internal conflict. The names Zainab, Sahar, and Geethi appeared repeatedly in those conversations. So did discussions about freedom, dating, independence, rules, control. Investigators learned that the daughters had not been living carefree lives. Reports emerged describing arguments over relationships and personal choices. Some accounts suggested the girls felt trapped between their families' expectations and the freedoms they observed around them in Canadian society. The conflict appeared particularly severe regarding Zainab. Her desire to make decisions about her own future reportedly generated intense anger within the household. The deeper detectives looked, the clearer the pattern became. This was not a family enjoying complete harmony before an unexpected tragedy. This was a family experiencing profound tension. That realization introduced a possible motive. And motive matters. Not because it proves guilt, but because it helps explain why a crime might occur. Without motive, investigators are left searching blindly. With motive, the pieces begin forming a recognizable shape. As detectives explored the possibility that the deaths were connected to family honor, they encountered a deeply disturbing theory. According to evidence later presented by prosecutors, certain members of the family believed the victims had brought shame upon the household. The daughters wanted greater independence. Rona reportedly supported them. Their behavior was viewed as unacceptable. If that theory was correct, then the victims were not random casualties. They were targets. The investigation now entered its most delicate phase. Detectives needed evidence stronger than suspicions and theories. They needed proof. Proof that would survive courtroom scrutiny. Proof that would convince a jury. Proof that could transform a disturbing hypothesis into criminal charges. One of the most powerful tools available to investigators involved surveillance and recorded conversations. As authorities monitored communications, they obtained discussions that would later become some of the most significant evidence in the case. Listening to recorded conversations can be an unsettling experience for investigators. Unlike physical evidence, recordings reveal emotions, attitudes, beliefs. They provide glimpses into how people speak when they think nobody is listening. In this case, prosecutors later argued that certain conversations revealed hostility toward the victims rather than grief over their deaths. The language was startling. Instead of sounding devastated by tragedy, some statements appeared filled with anger and contempt. For detectives, those recordings represented a potential breakthrough. Yet the investigation remained far from simple. Defense attorneys would eventually challenge interpretations. Alternative explanations existed. Investigators still needed to establish not only motive but participation. Who planned the crime? Who carried it out? Who was present? Who knew what would happen? Those questions remained unanswered. The complexity of family homicide investigations often lies in the emotional relationships involved. Unlike crimes committed by strangers, family murders frequently emerge from years of accumulated resentment, conflict, and control. Evidence is rarely straightforward. Family members protect one another. Stories evolve. Loyalties complicate the search for truth. The Shafia investigation reflected all of those challenges. At times, detectives encountered dead ends. Certain leads produced little information. Some witnesses knew very little. Others were reluctant to speak. The family itself remained central to the mystery. Investigators found themselves repeatedly returning to the same individuals. Muhammad Shafia, Tuba Yehya, Hamed Shafia, the father, the second wife, the son. As evidence accumulated, the focus increasingly narrowed around them. Still, detectives understood the importance of caution. The allegations were extraordinary. Accusing parents and a sibling of murdering family members required overwhelming evidence. Anything less could risk a miscarriage of justice. Therefore, every detail underwent careful examination. Phone records were reviewed. Travel routes were reconstructed. Vehicle damage was analyzed repeatedly. Statements were compared line by line. Investigators searched for inconsistencies that could reveal deception. Often, major criminal cases are solved not by a single dramatic discovery, but through the gradual accumulation of facts. One fact confirms another. One contradiction exposes a lie. One forensic result supports a witness statement. Eventually, a coherent narrative begins to emerge. That process was underway. By mid-July 2009, detectives increasingly believed they understood what had happened. The deaths were not accidental. The collision appeared intentional. The motive appeared rooted in family conflict and perceived dishonor. The remaining task was proving it. As authorities prepared their case, pressure mounted. Public attention intensified. Journalists followed developments closely. Community leaders expressed concern. The case was no longer merely a local investigation. It had become a national story. People across Canada watched closely as details emerged. Many struggled to comprehend the allegations. The idea that a father could orchestrate the deaths of his own daughters seemed almost unimaginable. Yet investigators believed the evidence pointed precisely in that direction. Then came the moment that changed everything. On July 23, 2009, police moved decisively. Mohammed Shafia was arrested. Tuba Yehia was arrested. Hamed Shafia was arrested. All three were charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. The announcement sent shockwaves across the country. News broadcasts interrupted regular programming. Newspapers published front-page coverage. Commentators debated the implications. The arrests marked the end of one phase of the investigation and the beginning of another. Detectives believed they had identified those responsible. But identifying suspects is only part of the journey. Now prosecutors would need to present their evidence before a court of law. They would need to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. And they would need to demonstrate that the deaths of Rona, Zainab, Sahar, and Geethi were not the result of an accident. Not a misunderstanding. Not a tragic mistake. But a carefully planned act of murder. As investigators organized evidence and prepared for trial, one reality remained impossible to escape. 4 women were dead. A mother and 3 daughters had lost their lives. The people accused of causing those deaths were members of their own family. And the truth hidden beneath the waters of the Rideau Canal was finally beginning to surface. Every major criminal investigation reaches a moment when scattered pieces suddenly begin fitting together. For weeks, detectives studying the deaths of Rona Amir Mohammed, Zainab Shafia, Sahar Shafia, and Geethi Shafia had been collecting fragments of evidence. Some were physical. Others were emotional. Some came from forensic laboratories. Others came from conversations, interviews, and observations. Alone, each piece raised questions. Together, they began revealing something far more powerful. The breakthrough did not arrive as a dramatic confession. It did not come from a single eyewitness stepping forward at the last moment. Instead, it emerged gradually through the relentless work of investigators determined to understand exactly what had happened. By the time authorities had completed extensive forensic examinations, reconstructed the family's movements, and analyzed recorded conversations, a narrative was beginning to take shape. And it was a narrative far different from the accident story initially presented. The most significant breakthrough involved the collision evidence. For weeks, experts had been examining the damaged Nissan Sentra and the family's Lexus SUV. Vehicle reconstruction specialists approached the case with scientific precision. Every dent carried information. Every broken component told part of a story. The laws of physics cannot be persuaded, intimidated, or manipulated. Metal remembers impact. As analysts compared damage patterns, they became increasingly confident that the Nissan had not entered the canal on its own. The evidence suggested contact. Force. A deliberate collision. Fragments recovered from the scene linked the Lexus to the Nissan in a manner investigators found difficult to explain through accident alone. This finding was crucial. Without it, the case might have remained trapped in uncertainty. With it, detectives could argue that another vehicle had played an active role in the deaths. But proving contact was only the beginning. The next challenge involved motive. Why would anyone intentionally force a vehicle carrying 4 women into the water? The answer emerged through a combination of interviews, family history, and recorded conversations. Investigators began building a detailed portrait of life inside the Shafia household. What they discovered was deeply troubling. The conflict between the victims and certain family members had not been minor. It had been persistent, intense, personal. For years, disagreements had centered around freedom, independence, and control. Zainab's relationship with a young man became a particularly important focus. Investigators learned that her desire to choose her own path had generated significant anger within the family. She wanted autonomy. She wanted opportunities available to countless other young women in Canada. She wanted the right to make decisions about her own life. According to prosecutors, those desires were interpreted not as normal steps toward adulthood, but as acts of defiance. The same pattern appeared elsewhere. Sahar wanted greater freedom. Geethi was growing up within the same environment. Rona reportedly supported her daughters and sought more independence for herself. Each development intensified tensions inside the household. The breakthrough came when detectives connected those tensions directly to evidence gathered after the deaths. Secretly recorded conversations proved particularly important. Investigators spent countless hours reviewing recordings, transcripts, and translated statements. Listening to hundreds of hours of conversation requires extraordinary patience. Most recordings contain mundane details. Small talk, complaints, repetition. Occasionally, however, a statement changes everything. In the Shafia investigation, authorities believed they found such statements. Prosecutors later argued that the conversations revealed not grief, but hostility. Not heartbreak, but resentment. The language used regarding the victims shocked investigators. Rather than speaking about beloved family members lost in a tragic accident, certain comments appeared to express contempt toward the women who had died. For detectives, this was a major breakthrough. The recordings helped establish mindset. They helped explain motive. Most importantly, they supported the theory that the deaths were connected to perceived family dishonor. As investigators dug deeper, another disturbing picture emerged. The victims had not simply disagreed with family rules. Evidence suggested they had expressed fear. There were indications that some of the daughters felt trapped. Reports emerged describing efforts to seek help, discussions about restrictions, conversations about escaping control. When detectives assembled these accounts alongside forensic evidence, a pattern became visible. The deaths no longer appeared isolated. They appeared connected to years of escalating conflict. Investigators also examined communication records, phone data, travel records, vehicle movements. The family trip itself became a subject of intense scrutiny. Authorities reconstructed the journey almost minute by minute. Every stop, every route, every interaction. The goal was simple: determine whether the events at Kingston Mills Locks were spontaneous or planned. The answer investigators arrived at was chilling. Evidence increasingly suggested preparation, not an impulsive act committed in sudden anger, not a momentary loss of control, something more deliberate, something requiring coordination, something prosecutors would later describe as premeditated. The possibility of planning transformed the entire case. Murder driven by sudden rage is horrifying enough. Murder that appears calculated carries an additional layer of darkness. It implies anticipation, decision-making, intent, the conscious choice to move forward despite opportunities to stop. For investigators, this realization represented the true breakthrough. The deaths were no longer viewed merely as suspicious. They appeared purposeful. As evidence accumulated, the focus narrowed around 3 individuals: Muhammad Shafia, Tuba Yehya, Hamed Shafia, the father, the second wife, the son. Detectives examined their statements repeatedly. Every interview became part of a larger puzzle. Certain explanations changed over time. Certain details conflicted with physical evidence. The inconsistencies became increasingly difficult to ignore. In many criminal investigations, suspects damage their own credibility long before trial. Not because they confess, not because they reveal everything, but because maintaining a false narrative becomes increasingly difficult when confronted by facts. That appeared to be happening here. Each forensic finding created new pressure. Each contradiction created new suspicion. Each recorded conversation weakened the accident explanation. Eventually, the weight of evidence became too substantial to dismiss. The investigation reached a point where detectives believed they understood the essential truth of what had occurred. The breakthrough was complete. Now came the challenge of proving it. Building a homicide case requires more than confidence. Prosecutors must anticipate every defense argument, every alternative explanation, every attempt to reinterpret evidence. They began organizing their case meticulously. Forensic reports were reviewed. Witnesses were prepared. Experts were consulted. Investigators worked closely with prosecutors to ensure that every conclusion could be explained clearly to a future jury. The stakes were enormous, for lives had been lost. The allegations involved family members murdering their own relatives. The case touched on sensitive cultural issues that demanded careful handling. Nothing could be left to chance. As preparations continued, public attention intensified. News coverage expanded across Canada. Many people struggled to comprehend the allegations. The notion that parents could view their daughters as sources of dishonor seemed deeply disturbing. Yet investigators believed that understanding was essential to understanding motive. This was not a crime driven by financial gain, not a robbery, not a dispute over property. According to prosecutors, it was a crime driven by control, by authority, by the belief that certain behaviors justified extreme punishment. The breakthrough evidence helped explain why the victims had been targeted, but it also raised a heartbreaking question. Could the tragedy have been prevented? Looking backward, warning signs appeared everywhere. Reports of family conflict, expressions of fear, attempts to seek greater freedom, tensions known to people around the victims. Yet hindsight is always clearer than reality. At the time, few people could have imagined how deadly those conflicts would become. As investigators prepared to present their findings, the emotional impact of the case became impossible to ignore. Photographs of the victims appeared in news reports. The smiling faces of 3 daughters and their mother stood in stark contrast to the allegations being discussed in court documents and police statements. The gap between those images and the violent deaths they suffered felt almost unbearable. For detectives who had spent months immersed in the evidence, the breakthrough brought mixed emotions. There was satisfaction in solving the mystery, relief in uncovering the truth, but there was also sadness, because solving the case could not bring the victims back. It could not restore the futures that had been stolen. It could not erase the terror of their final hours. The truth had finally emerged. The canal had surrendered its secrets. The evidence had spoken. The investigation had crossed the threshold from suspicion to certainty. Now the case would move into a new arena. A courtroom, a place where evidence would be challenged, where lawyers would battle over interpretation, where motive, intent, and responsibility would be debated before a jury, and where the story of Rona, Zainab, Sahar, and Geethi would be examined in extraordinary detail. The breakthrough had revealed what investigators believed happened. The next step would determine whether they could prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Because in the Canadian justice system, truth alone is not enough. Truth must be demonstrated. Evidence must be presented. And 12 jurors must ultimately decide whether the people accused of these murders were guilty. The answers that emerged from the Rideau Canal were powerful. But the most dramatic confrontation of all was still ahead. A confrontation that would unfold under courtroom lights rather than beneath dark water. A confrontation that would force an entire country to confront the horrifying possibility that family loyalty had been transformed into something deadly. And a confrontation that would decide whether justice would finally be delivered for 4 women whose voices could no longer speak for themselves. By the time the Shafia family murder case reached trial, the investigation had already captivated Canada. For more than 2 years, journalists, legal experts, community leaders, and ordinary citizens had followed every development. The story contained elements that seemed almost impossible to reconcile. A wealthy family, 3 teenage daughters, a mother seeking freedom, a submerged car, allegations of honor-based violence. And at the center of everything, a father, a mother, and a son accused of murdering 4 members of their own family. When court proceedings finally began, the atmosphere was unlike that of an ordinary criminal trial. This was not simply a legal battle. It was a public examination of a family's hidden life. Every conflict, every argument, every decision, every lie, everything would be exposed. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors faced the enormous challenge of explaining a complex and emotionally charged case to a jury. Unlike television dramas, real trials unfold slowly. Evidence is presented piece by piece. Witnesses testify. Experts explain technical findings. Lawyers challenge interpretations. Jurors absorb information over weeks and months rather than hours. The Shafia trial followed that pattern. The prosecution's case rested on a central argument. The deaths of Rona Amir Muhammad, Zainab Shafia, Sahar Shafia, and Geethi Shafia were not accidental. They were murders, premeditated murders. And according to prosecutors, the motive behind those murders was rooted in a belief that the victims had brought dishonor upon the family. To support that argument, prosecutors introduced an extensive body of evidence gathered during the investigation. The jury heard about the damaged vehicles. They heard testimony from collision reconstruction experts who explained why the Nissan's journey into the canal could not be easily dismissed as an accident. Photographs of vehicle damage were examined in detail. Technical diagrams were presented. Experts described impact patterns and physical evidence connecting the Lexus SUV to the Nissan Sentra. The scientific testimony was methodical, careful, precise. Prosecutors wanted jurors to understand that the physical evidence pointed toward deliberate action rather than misfortune. But forensic evidence alone was not enough. To secure convictions for first-degree murder, prosecutors needed to establish motive and intent. That required revealing the private world inside the Shafia household. Witness after witness described tensions within the family. The jury learned about arguments involving dating, independence, and personal freedom. They heard about efforts by the daughters to live lives more consistent with those of their Canadian peers. They heard about restrictions imposed upon them. They heard about fear. One of the most powerful aspects of the prosecution's case involved recorded conversations and statements that investigators had gathered after the deaths. As transcripts were introduced, jurors gained insight into attitudes and beliefs that prosecutors argued revealed motive. The courtroom became intensely quiet during many of these moments, because this evidence did more than establish facts. It exposed emotions: anger, resentment, contempt. The prosecution argued that these feelings helped explain why the victims had been targeted. The image presented by prosecutors was devastating. 3 daughters and their mother had become obstacles, not because they committed crimes, not because they threatened anyone's safety, but because they challenged authority. They wanted freedom. They wanted choices. They wanted control over their own futures. According to prosecutors, those desires were viewed as unacceptable. As testimony continued, the jury also learned about Rona Amir Muhammad's situation. She was not simply a bystander caught in family conflict. Evidence suggested she increasingly supported her daughters. She reportedly desired greater independence herself. The prosecution argued that this made her a target as well. In their narrative, the 4 victims were linked together by a common thread. All 4 represented resistance to control. All 4 represented challenges to authority. All 4 became victims of the same deadly decision. The defense, however, fought aggressively against these conclusions. Defense attorneys argued that the prosecution's interpretation of events was flawed. They challenged assumptions. They questioned motives attributed to the accused. They attacked portions of the forensic analysis. Most importantly, they maintained that the deaths could not be proven to be intentional murders beyond a reasonable doubt. In criminal trials, defense attorneys are not required to prove innocence. Their responsibility is to challenge the prosecution's case, to identify weaknesses, to raise doubt, to question conclusions. The defense attempted exactly that. They suggested alternative explanations for the evidence. They argued that investigators had interpreted family dynamics unfairly. They challenged the idea that cultural beliefs alone could establish criminal intent. At times, the courtroom became the site of intense legal battles. Experts disagreed. Interpretations collided. The same evidence was presented through dramatically different lenses. For jurors, the responsibility was enormous. They were not merely deciding a legal question. They were determining whether 3 members of a family had participated in the murders of 4 others. The emotional weight of that decision was immense. Throughout the proceedings, photographs of the victims remained a powerful reminder of what was truly at stake. Zainab, Sahar, Geethi, Rona. Their faces appeared repeatedly during testimony. Each photograph represented a life interrupted, a future erased, a voice silenced. As weeks turned into months, the trial continued building toward its conclusion. Witnesses completed their testimony. Experts finished explaining forensic findings. Attorneys delivered arguments designed to persuade the jury. The prosecution's closing arguments focused heavily on motive, planning, and evidence of deliberate action. They argued that the deaths were the culmination of years of family conflict. They argued that the victims had been viewed as sources of shame. They argued that the collision at Kingston Mills Locks was not an accident, but a carefully orchestrated act of murder. The defense urged jurors to remain cautious, to remember the burden of proof, to reject assumptions, to consider alternative possibilities. Then came the waiting. After months of testimony and argument, the case rested in the hands of the jury. 12 ordinary citizens now carried extraordinary responsibility. Behind closed doors, they reviewed evidence. They discussed testimony. They debated interpretations. Every detail mattered. Every conclusion mattered. Outside the courtroom, journalists waited anxiously. Families waited anxiously. The entire country seemed to wait anxiously. The verdict would determine not only the fate of the accused, but also how history would remember one of Canada's most disturbing family tragedies. On January 29, 2012, the jury reached its decision. The courtroom filled with tension. Every person present understood the significance of the moment. Years of investigation, months of trial proceedings, countless hours of testimony. Everything had led here. The verdicts were read. Guilty. 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 Mohammed Shafia was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder. Tuba Yehia was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder. Haim Shafia was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder. The jury rejected the accident explanation. They rejected alternative theories. They accepted the prosecution's argument that the deaths had been deliberate murders. For the victims' supporters, the verdict brought a measure of justice. Not closure. True closure rarely exists in cases involving such profound loss. But justice. A formal recognition that what happened to Rona, Zainab, Sahar, and Geethi was wrong. A recognition that their lives mattered. A recognition that those responsible would be held accountable. The sentencing phase followed. Canadian law mandated severe punishment for first-degree murder convictions. All 3 defendants received life sentences. They would not be eligible for parole for at least 25 years. The sentences reflected the seriousness of the crimes. Yet even the harshest sentence could not restore what had been lost. No verdict could return a mother to her daughters. No prison term could give Zainab the future she imagined. No punishment could allow Sahar to reach adulthood. No sentence could let Geethi experience the decades of life that should have awaited her. The legal process had ended. The criminal case was resolved. But the broader impact of the trial continued long after the verdicts. Across Canada, people debated the meaning of the case. Some viewed it as an example of honor-based violence. Others focused on domestic abuse and coercive control. Many saw it as a reminder that danger can exist within families regardless of social status or appearance. Experts discussed warning signs. Advocates discussed protection for vulnerable women and girls. Communities reflected on how fear can remain hidden behind closed doors. For investigators and prosecutors, the verdict validated years of work. The evidence recovered from a submerged car in the Rideau Canal had ultimately led to convictions. The truth buried beneath water had survived scrutiny in a courtroom. The victims' stories had been heard. The evidence had spoken, and a jury had delivered its answer. Yet even after justice was served, one haunting reality remained impossible to escape. The case was never truly about the defendants. It was about 4 women whose lives ended long before their time. A mother, 3 daughters, a family fractured by control, fear, and violence. And although the courtroom had finally delivered judgment, the emotional consequences of what happened would continue echoing far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The verdict closed the legal chapter of the story. But the deeper questions, the questions about freedom, power, family, and the cost of silence, would remain for years to come. When the courtroom doors finally closed and the media attention gradually began to fade, many people assumed the story had reached its conclusion. The arrests had been made. The trial had ended. The verdicts had been delivered. Mohammed Shafia, Tuba Yehia, and Haim Shafia had been sentenced to life imprisonment. From a legal perspective, the case was finished. But for the people left behind, nothing was finished. Because justice and healing are not the same thing. A guilty verdict can establish responsibility. It can acknowledge wrongdoing. It can punish those responsible. But it cannot restore a life. It cannot return a daughter to her childhood bedroom. It cannot place a mother's hand back into the hands of her children. It cannot recreate birthdays that will never be celebrated or futures that will never be lived. Long after the headlines disappeared, for empty spaces remained. For voices were gone. For lives had been erased. The story of the Shafia murders continues to haunt Canada because it forces people to confront one of the most disturbing realities of human behavior. Sometimes the greatest danger does not come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the people a victim is expected to trust the most. For most people, family represents safety. It represents protection. It represents unconditional love. Parents are supposed to defend their children. Brothers are supposed to protect their sisters. A home is supposed to be a refuge from the dangers of the outside world. In this case, prosecutors argued that the opposite occurred. The very people entrusted with protecting these women became the people accused of destroying them. That reality shocked the nation far beyond the details of the crime itself. Canadians had witnessed terrible murders before. Serial killers, organized crime, random acts of violence. Yet there was something uniquely disturbing about this case. Perhaps it was the ages of the victims. 19, 17, 13, a mother in her 50s. Perhaps it was the image of three sisters dying together. Perhaps it was the evidence suggesting years of fear before the murders ever occurred. Or perhaps it was because so many warning signs appeared visible in hindsight. As experts later examined the case, one recurring question emerged. Could the tragedy have been prevented? The question has no easy answer. Many people who experience coercive control, domestic abuse, or family violence never report it. Others seek help but struggle to find protection. Some fear retaliation. Some fear isolation. Some fear they will not be believed. In cases involving strong family control, the barriers can become even more difficult to overcome. Victims may feel trapped between loyalty and survival, between hope and fear, between obedience and freedom. Looking back at the lives of Zainab, Sahar, Geethi, and Rona, investigators and advocates saw numerous signs of distress. Conflicts had been reported. Fear had been expressed. Concerns had surfaced. Yet none of those warning signs ultimately prevented the violence that followed. That realization became one of the most painful lessons of the entire case. The murders sparked conversations across Canada about issues that many people had previously avoided discussing. Domestic violence, coercive control, women's rights, cultural conflict, family power structures, the vulnerability of young women living under extreme restrictions. The challenge was discussing these issues responsibly. Many experts warned against reducing the case to stereotypes or broad assumptions about entire communities. Millions of immigrant families successfully balance tradition and modern life without violence. Millions of parents hold conservative values while loving and supporting their children. The crime was not inevitable because of culture. It was not inevitable because of religion. It was not inevitable because of immigration. It was the result of decisions made by individuals. Decisions that investigators and prosecutors argued culminated in murder. Understanding that distinction became important. Because when societies focus solely on cultural explanations, they risk overlooking the universal nature of abuse. Control exists everywhere. Fear exists everywhere. Violence exists everywhere. The details may vary, but the underlying patterns often remain remarkably similar. An abuser seeks power. A victim seeks freedom. Conflict escalates. Isolation grows. Fear becomes normal. And unless intervention occurs, the situation can become dangerous. In the years following the trial, the names of the victims continued appearing in academic studies, documentaries, legal discussions, and public conversations about violence against women. Not because people wanted to sensationalize their deaths, but because their story carried lessons. Lessons written at a terrible cost. Zainab's story reminds us how dangerous it can become when a young woman's choices are treated as threats rather than rights. Sahar's story reminds us that adolescence should be a period of growth, not fear. Geethi's story reminds us that children often become victims of conflicts they never created. And Rona's story reminds us of the quiet suffering endured by countless women who spend years trapped in controlling environments. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the case is imagining the futures that disappeared. Zainab was standing at the threshold of adulthood. Somewhere, there is a version of history where she graduates, builds a career, falls in love, and grows old. Sahar might have attended university. She might have traveled. She might have discovered passions nobody ever had the chance to see. Geethi might have become anything. A teacher, a doctor, an artist, a mother, a scientist. At 13, every possibility still existed. And Rona might finally have experienced the freedom she reportedly longed for. Those futures vanished beneath the water of the Rideau Canal. Not because of fate, not because of chance, but because, according to the verdict, someone chose to take them away. As the years passed, the physical crime scene remained unchanged. The Rideau Canal continued flowing through Ontario. Boats continued passing through Kingston Mills locks. Tourists continued visiting the historic waterway. Most people standing there today would see only a peaceful landscape. Calm water, stone walls, blue sky reflected on the surface. Nothing about the location immediately reveals the horror connected to it. Yet beneath that ordinary appearance lies the memory of one of Canada's most disturbing family murder cases. A reminder that evil rarely announces itself dramatically. More often, it develops quietly, behind closed doors, inside ordinary homes, within relationships that appear normal to outsiders. The Shafia case ultimately became about more than a criminal conviction. It became a warning about the dangers of unchecked control, a warning about the consequences of treating human beings as possessions rather than individuals, a warning about what can happen when power becomes more important than love. Because love does not demand absolute obedience. Love does not destroy freedom. Love does not punish independence. Love does not force people to live in fear. When authority begins replacing compassion, when control begins replacing trust, and when domination begins replacing respect, families can become dangerous places. That lesson extends far beyond this single case. It applies to communities everywhere, to relationships everywhere, to families everywhere. Today, when people remember the Shafia murders, they often focus on the crime itself. The canal, the trial, the verdict, the shocking details. But perhaps the victims deserve something more. Perhaps they deserve to be remembered not only for the way they died, but for what they wanted while they were alive. A mother seeking dignity, a young woman seeking love, a teenager seeking freedom, a child seeking the chance to grow up. Their dreams were not extraordinary. They were profoundly human. And that may be why this case continues to resonate so deeply. Because beneath the legal arguments, the forensic evidence, and the courtroom drama lies a simple truth. For women wanted the same thing that countless people want every day. The right to live their own lives. The right to make their own choices. The right to exist without fear. They never received that chance. What remains now is memory. The memory of lives interrupted. The memory of warnings that went unheard. The memory of a tragedy that shocked a nation. And the hope that by remembering Zainab, Sahar, Geethi, and Rona, future victims living in silence may be recognized before it is too late. The water at Kingston Mills eventually became calm again. The headlines eventually disappeared. The trial eventually ended. But the story never truly vanished. Because some cases leave scars that remain long after the verdict. And some names continue echoing long after the courtroom falls silent. Years after the verdicts were delivered, the Shafia murders continued to occupy a unique place in Canada's collective memory. Most criminal cases gradually fade from public consciousness. New headlines appear. New tragedies emerge. Public attention moves elsewhere. Yet some cases refuse to disappear. They remain alive because they touch something deeper than the crime itself. They force society to examine uncomfortable truths about power, family, fear, and the hidden lives that exist behind closed doors. The deaths of Rona Amir Muhammad, Zainab Shafia, Sahar Shafia, and Geethi Shafia became one of those cases. For criminologists, it became a case study. For legal scholars, it became a landmark prosecution. For advocates working with vulnerable women and girls, it became a warning. For many Canadians, it became a symbol of lives lost to control and violence. But beyond all the analysis, reports, documentaries, and discussions, there remains a simpler and more painful reality. For people woke up on what seemed like an ordinary day. They did not know they were living their final hours. That thought alone is enough to haunt anyone who studies the case. Human beings naturally imagine the future. We make plans for next week, next month, next year. We assume there will be another morning, another opportunity, another conversation. The victims likely did the same. Perhaps Zainab was thinking about her future relationships. Perhaps Sahar was thinking about school, friends, or adulthood. Perhaps Geethi was focused on concerns only a 13-year-old would understand. Perhaps Rona was imagining a future in which life might finally become easier. None of them knew how little time remained. That tragic disconnect between expectation and reality exists in nearly every homicide case. Victims continue planning their futures while danger quietly approaches. The future feels guaranteed until suddenly it isn't. In the years following the trial, Many experts revisited the warning signs that appeared throughout the Shafia family's history. The reports of conflict, the allegations of control, the expressions of fear, the tensions surrounding independence. Again and again, people ask the same question. What could have been done differently? There is no perfect answer. Violence within families often remains hidden. Victims may conceal abuse out of fear. Witnesses may underestimate danger. Authorities may lack sufficient evidence to intervene. By the time outsiders recognize the seriousness of a situation, the opportunity to prevent tragedy may already be disappearing. Yet cases like this still provide valuable lessons. One lesson involves listening. People experiencing fear often communicate it indirectly. They may not explicitly say they believe their lives are in danger. Instead, they describe restrictions, isolation, threats, control, humiliation. Each detail may seem small on its own. Together, they can reveal something much more serious. Another lesson involves recognizing that abuse is not always physical. Many people imagine violence only as bruises and visible injuries. But coercive control often begins long before physical harm occurs. It starts with monitoring, restrictions, isolation, the gradual removal of personal freedom. By the time physical violence emerges, the victim may already be living inside a prison built from fear. The Shafia case highlighted those realities in ways that few criminal cases ever have. It challenged assumptions about what danger looks like. Danger does not always arrive wearing a mask. It does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it speaks with a familiar voice. Sometimes it sits at the dinner table. Sometimes it shares the same last name. That truth remains deeply unsettling. Perhaps that is why the case continues to resonate, because it forces people to reconsider one of society's most fundamental assumptions, that family automatically means safety. For most families, that assumption is true. For some, tragically, it is not. The story also reminds us how easily appearances can deceive. The Shafia family appeared successful. They owned expensive vehicles. They lived comfortably. They presented the image of stability. From a distance, many people might have described them as fortunate. Yet appearances reveal very little about what happens inside a home. Some of the most serious forms of abuse exist behind carefully maintained images of normalcy. Neighbors see smiles. Friends see photographs. Communities see success. Meanwhile, fear remains hidden. This pattern appears repeatedly in criminal investigations. The gap between public appearance and private reality can be enormous. The Shafia murders became one of the clearest examples of that divide. As years passed, the victims' names continued appearing in discussions about violence against women, not because people wanted to relive the horror, but because their stories mattered. Every victim deserves to be remembered as more than evidence in a courtroom, more than photographs in a case file, more than headlines in a newspaper. Zainab was not simply a murder victim. She was a young woman attempting to build her own identity. Sahar was not simply a victim. She was a teenager standing at the edge of adulthood. Geethi was not simply a victim. She was a child whose future remained unwritten. Rona was not simply a victim. She was a mother who had endured years of struggle while trying to protect those she loved. Remembering them as human beings changes the way we understand the case. It transforms statistics into lives, evidence into people, a crime into a loss. Perhaps that is the most important reason true crime stories continue to be told. Not to glorify violence, not to celebrate criminals, but to ensure victims are not forgotten. Because forgetting is its own form of tragedy. When society remembers victims, their stories continue serving a purpose. They educate, they warn, they inspire change. The Shafia case continues doing all three. Today, visitors still travel through Kingston Mills locks. Boats continue passing through the historic canal. Families take photographs. Children laugh along the water. Life continues, just as it always does. Most people who stand beside the Rideau Canal see only a peaceful landscape. Calm water, stone walls, gentle reflections dancing across the surface. Yet beneath that calm exterior lies the memory of a night that changed four lives forever. The water keeps moving. The seasons keep changing. Years keep passing. But some stories remain. And among those stories is the memory of a mother and three daughters whose lives ended in darkness, whose deaths shocked an entire nation, and whose names continue reminding us of the importance of freedom, dignity, and the right to live without fear. The criminal case ended with convictions. The legal questions received answers. The courtroom eventually fell silent. But the deeper message remains. Every person deserves autonomy. Every child deserves safety. Every woman deserves the freedom to choose her own future. When those principles are denied, tragedy becomes possible. The story of Rona, Zainab, Sahar, and Geethi ultimately stands as both a memorial and a warning. A memorial to 4 lives lost far too soon, and a warning about what can happen when control becomes more important than compassion, when power becomes more important than love, and when fear is allowed to grow unchecked inside the place that should feel safest of all. That is why the case endures. That is why the victims are remembered. And that is why, long after the final verdict was read, their story continues to matter. There is a moment in nearly every major criminal case when the facts stop being the most important part of the story. The evidence has been collected. The verdict has been delivered. The sentences have been imposed. Legally, the case is complete. Yet emotionally, psychologically, and socially, the story continues long after the courtroom lights have been turned off. The Shafia murders belong to that category of cases. More than a decade after the deaths of Rona Amir Muhammad, Zainab Shafia, Sahar Shafia, and Geethi Shafia, people continue discussing what happened, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the questions it raises about human nature itself. How does a family reach such a point? How does love become control? How does authority become domination? How does a disagreement become a death sentence? These questions have no simple answers. Human beings prefer clear explanations. We want villains to look different from ordinary people. We want evil to announce itself openly. We want danger to be obvious. The reality is rarely that simple. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Shafia case is how ordinary much of the story appeared from the outside. There was no secret criminal empire. No gang war. No ilaverat conspiracy in balbing strangers. There was simply a family living in a house, a family traveling together, a family eating meals together, a family presenting an image of normal life. Yet hidden beneath that image were years of conflict, resentment, fear, and control. That contrast forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous situations are often the ones hidden behind ordinary appearances. When people imagine violent crime, they frequently picture sudden explosions of rage, arguments escalating unexpectedly, impulsive acts committed in moments of emotional chaos. The evidence presented during the Shafia trial suggested something different. It suggested a gradual process, a slow accumulation of anger, a growing obsession with obedience, a belief that certain family members had become problems rather than people. This transformation is one of the most frightening aspects of abusive environments. Victims gradually stop being viewed as individuals with thoughts, feelings, and rights. Instead, they become symbols, obstacles, sources of frustration, representations of disobedience. Once that shift occurs, violence becomes easier to justify in the mind of an abuser. The victims become less human. Their suffering becomes less important. Their freedom becomes negotiable. Their lives become expendable. Psychologists who study coercive control often describe this process as a form of dehumanization. Not the dramatic dehumanization associated with war or genocide. Something quieter. Something domestic. Something that develops slowly inside relationships. The victim's needs become irrelevant. The victim's desires become offensive. The victim's independence becomes threatening. The victim's humanity becomes secondary to the abuser's need for control. Looking at the lives of Zainab, Sahar, Geethi, and Rona through this lens reveals why the case continues to resonate so deeply. The conflict was never truly about dating. It was never truly about clothing. It was never truly about friendships. Those issues were symptoms. The deeper issue involved power. Who had it? Who was allowed to exercise it? Who was permitted to make decisions? And who was expected to obey? At its core, the case became a battle between control and autonomy. The daughters wanted increasing control over their own lives. Rona reportedly wanted greater independence as well. According to prosecutors, those desires collided with a worldview that demanded obedience above all else. The result was catastrophic. Yet there is another reason the case remains significant. It exposed the limitations of society's ability to recognize danger. Many people assume severe abuse is always visible, that victims will clearly announce what is happening, that warning signs will be impossible to miss. Reality often looks very different. Victims frequently minimize their own suffering. Fear discourages disclosure. Isolation limits opportunities for help. Shame creates silence. Threats create compliance. Even when victims speak, outsiders may underestimate the seriousness of the situation. The Shafia case highlighted all of these realities. Looking backward, numerous warning signs appear visible. At the time, however, those signs were scattered across different moments, different people, and different contexts. No single observer possessed the entire picture. This pattern appears repeatedly in domestic violence cases. The information exists. The danger exists. But the full scope remains hidden until tragedy occurs. That realization continues influencing discussions among social workers, educators, law enforcement officials, and victim advocates throughout Canada. The case became more than a criminal investigation. It became a lesson. A painful lesson purchased at an unimaginable cost. For many educators, the story is now used to help identify warning signs of coercive control. For victim advocates, it serves as a reminder that threats against personal freedom should never be dismissed. For law enforcement, it demonstrates the importance of taking family conflict seriously when fear and control are present. The lessons continue long after the legal proceedings ended. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire story is the lost potential. Every homicide involves stolen possibilities. But cases involving young victims make that loss especially visible. Imagine Zainab surviving into adulthood. Imagine the life she might have built, the relationships she might have formed, the experiences she might have enjoyed. Imagine Sahar reaching her 20s, her 30s, her 40s. Imagine Geethi growing from a 13-year-old girl into a woman with an entire lifetime of memories. Imagine Rona finally achieving the freedom she reportedly sought. These imagined futures never became reality. Instead, they exist only as possibilities. Potential lives frozen forever in time. When people remember homicide victims, they often focus on the moment of death. Yet victims spend far more time living than dying. The challenge is remembering them for the years they experienced rather than the minutes that ended those years. Zainab was not defined by a canal. Sahar was not defined by a courtroom. Geethi was not defined by a police investigation. Rona was not defined by an autopsy report. They were human beings long before they became victims. That distinction matters. Because when victims become nothing more than case studies, their individuality disappears. Their humanity fades. Their stories become statistics. The Shafia case reminds us why that must never happen. At the center of every criminal file is a person. At the center of every forensic report is a life. At the center of every homicide investigation is a future that no longer exists. The legal system can deliver accountability. It cannot restore what was lost. Years later, Canada continues to remember the case because it represents more than 4 murders. It represents a collision between fear and freedom, control and independence, power and dignity. Those themes are universal. They transcend geography, language, religion, and culture. They appear wherever one person believes they have the right to dominate another. That is why the story remains relevant. Not because the circumstances were common, but because the underlying dynamics are. Every day, somewhere in the world, individuals struggle for autonomy within controlling environments. Every day, victims weigh the risks of speaking out. Every day, families navigate conflicts involving authority and independence. Most never become criminal cases. Some do. The Shafia murders stand as a reminder of what can happen when control grows unchecked and when the humanity of others becomes secondary to the desire for power. The canal where the victims died has long since returned to normal. Boats continue passing through the locks. Water continues flowing. Tourists continue visiting. Nature remains indifferent to human tragedy. But memory works differently. Memory preserves what water cannot. Memory keeps names alive. Memory keeps stories alive. Memory allows future generations to learn from past mistakes. And perhaps that is the final purpose of remembering this case. Not merely to revisit horror. Not merely to analyze crime. But to honor 4 women whose lives mattered. For women who wanted what most people want. Freedom, Safety, respect, the ability to decide their own futures. Simple desires, human desires, the kind of desires no one should ever have to die for. As long as those names continue to be remembered, Rona, Zainab, Sahar, and Geethi, the story remains unfinished in the most important sense. Because remembrance itself is a form of justice, a refusal to allow victims to disappear, a refusal to reduce them to evidence, a refusal to let their lives be forgotten. And in that remembrance, long after the verdict, long after the trial, and long after the headlines have faded, their voices continue to echo. If there is one image that remains at the end of this story, it is not the courtroom. It is not the police station. It is not even the submerged Nissan resting beneath the dark waters of the Rideau Canal. The image that remains is far simpler. 4 women sitting together. A mother, 3 daughters, sharing a meal, talking about ordinary things, laughing at small jokes, dreaming about the future. Because before they became victims, that is what they were. Human beings. People with hopes, fears, memories, and plans. True crime stories often risk becoming collections of evidence. Dates replace personalities. Crime scene photographs replace human faces. Court transcripts replace real lives. The passage of time can make victims seem like characters rather than people. The Shafia case challenges that tendency. Every fact in this story ultimately leads back to 4 individuals whose lives mattered. Rona Amir Muhammad, Zainab Shafia, Sahar Shafia, Geethi Shafia. Their names deserve to be spoken not because of the way they died, but because of the lives they lived before that final night. When historians look back on criminal cases, they often focus on outcomes. The investigation, the arrests, the trial, the verdict. Yet the deeper significance of a case is often found elsewhere. It is found in the lessons left behind, the warnings hidden within the tragedy, the opportunities for future lives to be protected. That may be the most important legacy of this case. Not the convictions, not the headlines, not the public outrage, but the conversations it started. Conversations about domestic abuse. Conversations about coercive control. Conversations about the importance of listening when someone expresses fear. Conversations about the difference between guidance and domination. Between family expectations and personal freedom. Between love and ownership. The case forced many people to confront a difficult reality. Control is not the same thing as care. Obedience is not the same thing as respect. Fear is not the same thing as love. These distinctions seem obvious when spoken aloud. Yet throughout history, countless victims have suffered because those lines became blurred. Some families demand obedience and call it protection. Some abusers demand submission and call it love. Some controllers demand silence and call it loyalty. The victims often understand the difference long before anyone else does. Unfortunately, their voices are not always heard. That is why stories like this continue to matter. Not because they are shocking, not because they attract attention, but because somewhere at this very moment there are people living with the same fears. Somewhere, a young woman feels trapped by restrictions she cannot escape. Somewhere, a mother wonders whether she will ever regain control of her own life. Somewhere, a teenager is afraid to speak honestly about what is happening at home. Somewhere, warning signs are already appearing. Most of those situations will never become murder cases. Most families experiencing conflict will never experience violence. But recognizing danger early can save lives. Listening can save lives. Taking fear seriously can save lives. One of the most powerful aspects of the Shafia case is that the victims themselves repeatedly pointed toward the truth before their deaths. They expressed frustration. They expressed fear. They expressed a desire for freedom. In hindsight, those expressions seem heartbreaking. Not because they predicted exactly what would happen, but because they revealed lives already burdened by pressure and control. When society learns from cases like this, the victims continue making a difference even after death. Their stories become warnings. Their experiences become lessons. Their memories become catalysts for change. Perhaps that is the closest thing to meaning that can ever emerge from such a tragedy. No lesson can justify what happened. No social progress can erase the suffering. No future improvement can restore stolen lives. But remembering the victims may help protect others. And that matters. As years become decades, public memory will inevitably fade. New generations will grow up without remembering the headlines. Many people will never hear the details of the investigation. Some will encounter the case only as a brief paragraph in a textbook or documentary. That is the fate of nearly every historical tragedy. Time moves forward. Memories soften. Details disappear. Yet certain truths remain timeless. The truth that every person deserves dignity. The truth that every child deserves safety. The truth that freedom should never be treated as a crime. The truth that love cannot exist where fear dominates every decision. These ideas remain relevant long after specific cases are forgotten. They remain relevant because they are fundamentally human. Perhaps that is why the story of the Shafia murders continues to resonate so deeply. At its heart, it is not merely a story about death. It is a story about the human desire to choose one's own path. Zainab wanted that. Sahar wanted that. Geethi deserved the chance to discover her own path someday. Rona wanted that as well. The tragedy is that those desires became sources of conflict rather than sources of support. Every healthy family eventually faces change. Children grow up. Values evolve. Generations disagree. Independence emerges. The overwhelming majority of families navigate those transitions through patience, compromise, and love. The Shafia case represents what can happen when control replaces those qualities. When authority becomes absolute. When disagreement becomes intolerable. When individual humanity becomes secondary to power. That lesson extends far beyond one family. Far beyond one community. Far beyond one country. It belongs to everyone. As this story comes to an end, it is worth returning one final time to the victims themselves. Not to the crime scene. Not to the trial. Not to the evidence. To the people. Imagine Zainab smiling during an ordinary afternoon. Imagine Sahar laughing with friends. Imagine Geethi discovering new interests as she moved through childhood. Imagine Rona hoping for a better future. Those moments existed. They were real. They mattered. And they deserve to be remembered alongside the tragedy. Because victims are always more than the worst thing that happened to them. They are the sum of their experiences, their relationships, their dreams, and their humanity. The legal system delivered its judgment. History recorded the facts. The investigation uncovered the truth. But memory carries a different responsibility. Memory asks us not only to remember how people died, but also how they lived. The waters of the Rideau Canal continue to flow today, just as they did on that summer morning in 2009. The current never stops. It moves forward endlessly. In many ways, human life is similar. Generations come and go. Stories fade. Time continues its relentless movement. Yet some stories leave marks that endure. The story of Rona, Zainab, Sahar, and Geethi is one of those stories. A story of lives interrupted. A story of dreams denied. A story of warnings that, in hindsight, seem painfully clear. But also a story that continues to encourage awareness, compassion, and vigilance. If there is any final message to carry forward from this case, perhaps it is this. Freedom is not a privilege granted by others. It is a fundamental part of human dignity. Every person deserves the right to live without fear. Every person deserves the right to make choices about their own future. Every person deserves to be treated not as property, not as an extension of someone else's reputation, but as a human being with value that exists independently of anyone else's approval. The 4 victims at the center of this story deserved those rights. They deserved long lives. They deserved opportunities. They deserved peace. Although they were denied those things, their story remains. And as long as it is remembered, their voices continue to speak across the years, reminding us why dignity, freedom, compassion, and respect must always be protected. This is where the case ends. But the lesson remains.